The garage door did not malfunction. There was no break-in at the front entrance. No shattered glass. No forced lock. No sign that anything at the exterior of the home had been touched, disturbed, or compromised in any way that a neighbor walking past the next morning would have noticed or remembered. Nothing about the outside of that house looked like the beginning of a crime. And that is exactly what made it one. Because here is the confirmed fact, not a theory, not a speculation, not the opinion of a television commentator filling airtime, the confirmed fact established by FBI forensic analysis and acknowledged by Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos at a press conference watched by millions of people. Someone had been watching Nancy Guthrie's home in Tucson, Arizona for 3 weeks before she disappeared. Not from a distance. Not from a car parked at the end of the street. From her front door. Standing at it. In the dark. Close enough to be captured on the Nest camera mounted at the entrance. The same camera that would later be physically ripped from the wall with bare hands and carried away into the night. That is where this case begins. Not on January 31, 2026, the night Nancy Guthrie walked into her garage and was never seen again. It begins on January 11th, a Saturday, 3 weeks earlier, when someone stood at the front door of an 84-year-old woman's home and did absolutely nothing. No knock. No attempt to enter. No reason that has ever been explained publicly. Just a figure. In the dark. At the door of a woman who lived alone, who needed daily heart medication to survive, who could not walk 50 yards without assistance, who had a pacemaker embedded in her chest that logged every heartbeat to a manufacturer's server around the clock, and who had no idea that the person standing outside her door that Saturday night would come back. Fully equipped. With a plan. And with knowledge of the inside of her home that no one standing outside it should ever have been able to possess. This is the case of Nancy Guthrie. And the night nobody saw coming had already started 3 weeks before it arrived. To understand what was taken on the night of January 31, 2026, you have to understand who Nancy Guthrie was before that night. Not the case. Not the headlines. The person. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had built a life that, by the time she arrived in Tucson, Arizona, had been deliberately shaped around one priority, being close to her daughter. That daughter is Annie Guthrie. You know her face. Annie Guthrie is the co-host of NBC's Today Show, one of the most recognized women in American morning television. Nancy moved to Tucson to be near her. That proximity was not a preference. According to Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, it was a medical necessity. Nancy could not walk 50 yards without assistance. She took heart medication every single day. Not occasionally. Not when she felt it was needed. Every day on schedule without exception. That medication sat on the counter inside her Tucson home, and it was still sitting there the morning her family realized she was gone. Embedded in her chest was a pacemaker. This detail matters more than most people watching the early news coverage understood, and we will return to it. The device did not simply regulate her heart. It logged continuous cardiac data, every beat, every rhythm, every fluctuation, and transmitted that information to a manufacturer's server independently. Not through her phone. Not through her home Wi-Fi network. On its own. Quietly. Around the clock. Whether Nancy thought about it or not, her pacemaker was keeping its own record of everything. Her life in Tucson had a shape. A rhythm that the people around her had come to know and rely on. On weekends, and particularly on Friday evenings, Nancy spent time at Annie's home. She ate there. She played cards. She stayed late the way people do when the evening is warm and the company is good and there is no reason to rush. It was the kind of routine that feels invisible until the moment it stops. The kind that only becomes significant in retrospect, when investigators are working backward through a timeline, asking who knew about it and how. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Cain, was part of that routine too. He drove Nancy home on those evenings. That was simply how things worked. Annie in Tommaso's home, dinner, cards, then Tommaso driving Nancy the short distance back to her own house on the northwest side of Tucson, watching her inside and heading home. A quiet, unremarkable act of care repeated week after week. On the night of January 31, 2026, Nancy did exactly what she always did. She went to Annie and Tommaso's home for the evening. She ate dinner with her family. She played cards. She stayed late. Nothing about that evening was unusual. Nothing about it was different from any of the dozens of Friday evenings that had come before it. Which is precisely why it was chosen. Because the people watching Nancy Guthrie's life were not watching for an anomaly. They were watching for the pattern. They were watching for the Friday evening that looked exactly like every other Friday evening. The one where Tommaso would drive her home, pull into the garage and leave. The one where Nancy would walk from the garage into her house, alone, at a time of night when no one on her street would be looking out their window. They had been watching long enough to know exactly when that moment would come. And when it did, on the night of January 31st, everything they had prepared for, the equipment, the coordination, the knowledge of the interior of her home, the unlocked back door that no camera on the property covered, was already in place. Nancy Guthrie left her medication on the counter that night. She left her Apple Watch on the counter too. She did not pack a bag. She did not prepare to go anywhere. She was home. And she was supposed to be safe. Here is what the record shows. Every timestamp that follows has been confirmed by law enforcement, documented in press conference statements by Sheriff Nanos, or reported by named journalists citing named sources. This is not reconstruction. This is the timeline as it exists in the official record. Approximately 6 p.m., Annie and Tommaso Cayen's home, Tucson, Arizona. Nancy Guthrie arrives for the evening. Dinner is prepared. The family is together. This is a Friday, the same as most Fridays. There is nothing in the record to suggest anything about this evening felt wrong to anyone present. It was ordinary. That is the word that keeps appearing in descriptions of it. An ordinary evening. 9:48 p.m., Nancy Guthrie's home, northwest Tucson, Arizona. Tommaso Cayen's vehicle pulls into the garage of Nancy's home. Surveillance footage from the property captures this moment. The time is confirmed. This is the last confirmed image of Nancy Guthrie in any surveillance record. She is in the car. The garage is opening. She is home. 9:50 p.m., Nancy Guthrie's home, northwest Tucson, Arizona. The garage door closes. Tommaso drives away. 2 minutes. That is the window between his arrival and his departure. 2 minutes in which Nancy moved from the car into the house, and the door came down behind her. After 9:50 p.m., there is no exterior footage. No additional movement captured from that side of the house. No record of any activity at the exterior of Nancy Guthrie's home for the next 4 hours. 4 hours of silence. 1:47 a.m., front entrance, Nancy Guthrie's home, northwest Tucson, Arizona. The Nest camera mounted at the front door of Nancy's home goes offline. This is not a power failure. This detail is critical and we will address it fully in the next section because it has been confirmed by the FBI and by Sheriff Nanos and it changes the shape of everything that follows. The device did not lose power. It did not malfunction. It did not experience a technical disruption of any kind. It was physically removed from its mount on the wall. By hand. And taken from the property. At 1:47 in the morning, someone walked to the front door of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home and took the camera. 2:12 a.m., Nancy Guthrie's home, northwest Tucson, Arizona. A second camera on the property registers a motion event. No video is captured. Only a timestamp. Something moved within range of that camera's sensor at 2:12 a.m., and the device recorded the moment without producing footage. That timestamp exists in the record. What triggered it has not been confirmed publicly. 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie's home, northwest Tucson, Arizona. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker stops syncing with her iPhone. This requires a moment of explanation. The pacemaker pairs with a phone when the two are in physical proximity. According to Sheriff Nanos, at 2:28 a.m., that sync dropped. The pacemaker continued its independent transmission to the manufacturer's server. It never stopped logging. But the pairing with her phone was severed. Which means one thing confirmed by Nanos in his public statements. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie was more than 30 feet from her own phone. Her Apple Watch was still inside the house. Her daily heart medication was still inside the house. Neither had been packed. Neither had been moved. According to Sheriff Nanos, both were left behind. 2:36 a.m., a residential street approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, Tucson, Arizona. A Ring camera belonging to a neighbor 2.5 miles from Nancy's property captures an unidentified vehicle. The footage confirms the vehicle's presence at that location at that time. As of the most recent public reporting, law enforcement has not publicly identified the make, the model, or the license plate. That is where the confirmed timeline ends. Between 9:50 p.m. on January 31st and the afternoon of February 1st, when Annie Guthrie called 911 after she could not reach her mother, there is no confirmed public record of where Nancy was, what happened inside that house, or how the night moved from a garage door closing to a woman being gone. What investigators found when they arrived at 12:15 p.m. on February 1st, what they found at the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's home, became one of the most examined pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. There was blood at the front door. The drops were round. They fell vertically, straight down, in the pattern that forensic analysts associate with a stationary source. There were no footprints interspersed between the drops. The blood was confirmed by DNA analysis. It belonged to Nancy Guthrie. And the camera that should have recorded whatever happened at that door was gone. Let us be precise about what the removal of that camera tells investigators, and what it tells us. A Nest camera is not a simple piece of hardware to neutralize. You cannot disable it by cutting a wire visible from the street. You cannot interfere with it remotely without leaving a digital trace. If you want to eliminate what it sees and what it records, you have one reliable option. You have to physically go to it and take it. That is what happened at 1:47 a.m. on February 1, 2026, at the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's home in northwest Tucson. According to the FBI, confirmed by Sheriff Nanos at a press conference and corroborated by the forensic analysis that followed, the device was removed from its wall mount by hand and taken from the property. Think about what that decision reveals. Whoever took that camera was not attempting a clean, invisible operation. They were not trying to leave a scene that looked undisturbed. They were eliminating a specific record. The record of what happened at that front door between 9:50 p.m. and whatever time the scene at the entrance was created. The blood that investigators found the next afternoon, the vertical drops that forensic analysts later determined came from a stationary source. Those drops were at the same entrance where that camera had been mounted. The camera was removed because of what it would have shown. And here is what that decision, that specific, physical, deliberate act of walking to a front door in the middle of the night and taking a camera off a wall, tells experienced investigators about the person who did it. They were not panicking. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente, whose analysis of the physical evidence at Nancy's home was reported across multiple outlets, has noted the methodical nature of the scene. People who panic make noise. People who panic run. People who panic do not stop at a front door at 1:47 in the morning and carefully remove a mounted camera before moving forward. This was not panic. This was a step in a sequence. And according to Sheriff Nanos, confirmed in his press conference statements, the FBI forensic team's examination of how the device was removed, the angle, the force, the physical marks left on the mount, was thorough enough to contribute to their profile of the individual captured in the surveillance footage from that same entrance. The camera was gone. But the mount remained. And in cases like this, what remains after a deliberate removal is often as informative as the object that was taken. The FBI had the mount. They had the footage from before the camera was removed. They had the motion timestamp from the second camera at 2:12 a.m. They had the Pacemaker sync record from 2:28 a.m. And then, through a forensic method that most people covering this case in the early days did not fully understand, they got something else entirely. Something that the person who took that camera almost certainly believed they had destroyed. They got the January 11th image. When the FBI forensic team took possession of the destroyed Nest camera, the physical device that had been removed from the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home and taken from the scene, they did not simply examine the hardware for fingerprints or physical trace evidence. They used chip-off forensics. For those unfamiliar with the method, chip-off forensics involves physically extracting the memory chip from a device and reading its stored data directly, bypassing the device's operating system entirely. It is used specifically in cases where a device has been damaged, destroyed, or tampered with, where the normal path to its data has been eliminated. According to Fox News reporter Michael Ruiz, citing two separate law enforcement sources, this is exactly the technique the FBI applied to the Nest camera recovered from Nancy Guthrie's property. But the chip-off analysis was only the beginning, because the Nest camera system does not store data only on the physical device. It transmits footage and images to a cloud backup, a Google server, continuously as it operates. And that transmission had been happening for weeks before the camera was ever removed from the wall. According to Michael Ruiz's reporting, confirmed by two separate law enforcement sources cited in his Fox News coverage, FBI forensic teams spent approximately 10 days working directly with Google to recover residual data from the device's cloud backup. 10 days. That is not a brief or routine extraction. That is a sustained technical collaboration between federal investigators and one of the largest data companies in the world, focused on a single camera at a single address in Tucson, Arizona. What they found was not just footage from the night of January 31st. They found images from January 11th, a Saturday, 3 weeks before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The same suspected individual, at the same front door of Nancy's Tucson home. At night. No backpack. No chest holster. No flashlight. No gear of any kind. He was not there to do anything that night. He was there to observe. To stand at the door of a woman who lived alone, who could not walk unassisted, who followed a predictable Friday evening routine with her daughter and son-in-law, and to look. To learn. To map the property, the camera positions, the entrance points, the rhythms of the neighborhood at that hour. According to the law enforcement sources cited by Michael Ruiz, the January 11th visit was what investigators classify as pre-operational surveillance. It is a documented behavioral pattern in crimes targeting elderly individuals who live alone and maintain visible, observable routines. The perpetrator visits first without equipment, confirms the target and the environment, identifies the vulnerabilities and the obstacles, and then returns when the preparation is complete and the window is right. The window arrived on January 31st. But here is the dimension of the January 11th visit that has received less attention than it deserves in the mainstream coverage of this case. January 11th was a Saturday. The FBI agents who later returned to Nancy's Tucson neighborhood on day 45 of the investigation, asking targeted questions of neighbors about contractors and cleaning crews who had been given access to homes in the area, specifically asked about January 24th as well. January 24th was also a Saturday. The pattern of Saturday activity by the suspected individual did not go unnoticed by investigators. A person who operates exclusively on Saturdays and late Friday nights is, statistically, a person with regular weekday obligations. A job. A schedule. A life structured around the conventional working week that makes Saturday the only viable window for this kind of preparation. That detail, the Saturday pattern, the weekday constraint it implies, is one of the threads the FBI has been quietly pulling since early in the investigation. The January 11th image, recovered through 10 days of forensic collaboration between federal investigators and Google, from a camera that had already been physically destroyed and removed from the scene, is one of the most significant pieces of evidence in this case. Because it proves, beyond any reasonable interpretation, that what happened to Nancy Guthrie on January 31st was not opportunistic. It was not random. It was not impulsive. It was planned. 3 weeks in advance. By someone who stood at her door in the dark, studied what they needed to know and came back. The question the January 11th image opens, and does not close, is this. What did he learn that night that made him confident enough to return? And who told him there was something worth learning? Every camera on Nancy Guthrie's Tucson property pointed forward. The Nest camera at the front entrance, the one removed at 1:47 a.m., covered the front door. The second camera on the property, the one that registered only a motion timestamp at 2:12 a.m. without capturing footage, was positioned at the side of the structure. The back of the property had no camera coverage. And the back door of Nancy Guthrie's home was unlocked. This detail, confirmed in the investigative record and noted in reporting by multiple journalists covering the case, did not receive the attention it deserved in the early weeks of coverage, because the early weeks of coverage were dominated entirely by the image of the man at the front door. The surveillance footage of the suspected individual arriving at the front entrance, carrying the Ozark Trail 25L backpack confirmed by Sheriff Nanos, the chest holster, the flashlight, the two-way radio, that image circulated in press briefings and news broadcasts, across social media and television screens, and was seen by millions of people. That was the story the public was given. But FBI forensic analysis of the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home told a different story, one that the front door image, by design, was never meant to support. DNA testing of the interior confirmed a mixed biological profile from at least 2 individuals. Neither profile belonged to Nancy Guthrie. Neither profile matched any entry in the federal CODIS database, the National Repository of DNA Profiles collected from convicted offenders and crime scene evidence across the United States. 2 people had been inside that house. 2 people whose DNA does not exist anywhere in the federal criminal record. 2 people. The man at the front door was one thread of this operation. The unlocked back door, uncovered, unrecorded, and unaddressed in the initial weeks of public information, was another. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffin-Dafer, whose analysis of the surveillance footage was reported by Newsweek, was unambiguous about what the walkie-talkie carried by the suspected individual at the front door means operationally. A walkie-talkie is not a solo instrument. It is a real-time coordination device. The person carrying it is in active communication with at least one other person at a different location. Someone who needs to be updated, directed, or confirmed with as events unfold. Which means at 1:47 a.m., when the front door camera was being removed, someone was talking to someone else. Not on a phone. On a two-way radio. Designed specifically for communication in environments where phone signals are unreliable or where call logs are a liability. The man at the front entrance, removing the camera, was the visible element of this operation. He was meant to be seen, or at least he was the element whose visibility was acceptable, whose presence at the front door explained the camera going offline, whose image on the circulated surveillance footage directed every camera and every question toward the front of the house. While the back door stayed dark, uncovered, unlocked, and whatever came through it left DNA inside Nancy Guthrie's home that has not been matched to a single entry in the entire federal criminal database. Stop here for one moment. If you are watching this and you are not yet subscribed to Cold Case Files USA, do it right now. Not at the end of this video. Right now, before we go any further. We need you to understand something. Videos covering active federal investigations, cases involving missing persons, unidentified DNA, law enforcement contradictions, get flagged. They get suppressed. We have had coverage on cases like this quietly removed without warning and without explanation. If you are not subscribed with notifications turned on, there is a genuine possibility that the next update on Nancy Guthrie's case, the one that names the DNA profiles, the one that identifies who was on the other end of that walkie-talkie, the one where the sheriff finally says what he has known since day one, never reaches you. One click. Subscribe now. Turn on every notification. Then stay. Because we are only halfway through what we know. Here is something that needs to be said directly. Someone watching this video right now has a piece of this case. It may not feel significant. It may be a name they heard in January. A face they noticed near a home in northwest Tucson. A conversation about a house, a schedule, a back door that was always left unlocked. If you are not subscribed to this channel, you will not be present when this investigation reaches the moment where that one detail closes the gap. And it will close. The FBI does not request 10 days of cloud recovery from Google and Walmart purchase records and neighborhood contractor canvases unless they are building toward a name. Subscribe to Cold Case Files USA now. Because in a case where someone stood at an 84-year-old woman's front door in the dark and studied her for 3 weeks before coming back, staying unconnected to this investigation is not a passive choice. It is a decision. Go back to 9:50 p.m. on January 31, 2026. The garage door of Nancy Guthrie's home in northwest Tucson is coming down. Tommaso Cayen's taillights are disappearing down the street. The neighborhood is quiet. It is a Friday night in January and there is nothing about the exterior of that house, nothing visible from the sidewalk or the street or any of the surrounding properties, that suggests the next few hours will be anything other than an ordinary night at the end of an ordinary week. Nancy is inside. Her medication is on the counter. Her Apple Watch is on the counter. Her pacemaker is recording. She does not know that 3 weeks ago on a Saturday night, someone stood at her front door and studied the property. She does not know that the back of her home has no camera coverage. She does not know that the back door she leaves unlocked, the door she has left unlocked for years because this is her home and this is Tucson, and the idea that someone was cataloging her vulnerabilities on a January Saturday night was not a thought that existed in her world, is exactly the detail someone built a plan around. She played cards that evening. She had dinner with her daughter. She was driven home by her son-in-law the way she had been driven home dozens of times before. She walked from the garage into her house. The door came down. And the people who had been watching her for 3 weeks, who knew her schedule, who knew her Friday evenings, who knew the inside of her home well enough to describe the exact location of a personal device in a room and a broken light fixture at the back of the property in notes they would send to a news station the following day, were already in motion. The man at the front door with the backpack and the holster and the walkie-talkie was not the primary threat. He was the distraction. He did not arrive unprepared. That is the first thing you need to understand about the man captured on surveillance footage at the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home in the early hours of February 1, 2026. Whatever else remains unconfirmed about this case, and there is much that remains unconfirmed, the equipment he carried to that front door has been documented, named and confirmed at a press conference by Pima County Sheriff Nanos. He carried an Ozark Trail 25-liter backpack. Black. Sold exclusively through Walmart. Confirmed by Sheriff Nanos. He wore a chest holster. Also a Walmart product. Also confirmed. He carried a flashlight, held in his mouth, both hands occupied, the beam pointed forward as he approached the entrance. And he carried a walkie-talkie. Not a phone. Not a signal jammer. Not a Bluetooth earpiece or any of the consumer-grade communication devices that a person moving alone through a neighborhood at 1:47 in the morning might carry for personal reassurance. A walkie-talkie. A two-way radio. A device with one specific operational purpose. Real-time voice communication with another person at a different location. Each item in that inventory tells a story on its own. Together, they tell a story that is far more significant than anything: the circulation of that surveillance image, the image that appeared on every news broadcast, in every press briefing, across every social media platform in the days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, ever communicated to the public. The backpack tells you he came prepared to carry something. The holster tells you he came prepared for resistance or encounter. The flashlight tells you he came prepared to work in darkness without using the lights of the house. And the walkie-talkie tells you he did not come alone. That last detail, the walkie-talkie, confirmed in the surveillance footage, analyzed by former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Cadaver and reporting by Newsweek, is the detail that reframes every other element of this case. Because the moment you establish that the man at the front door was in active communication with at least one other person at a different location, the story you were told about what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home that night is no longer complete. It is, at best, half of the picture. At worst, it is the half that was designed to be seen, while the other half moved through the back door that no camera on the property covered and that Nancy Guthrie had left unlocked. This is Chapter 2. And this is where the operation behind Nancy Guthrie's disappearance stops being a story about one man at one door and becomes something considerably more deliberate. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Cadaver spent her career inside the bureau reading crime scenes, behavioral evidence, and the operational signatures of people who plan crimes in advance. She is not a television commentator offering speculation for airtime. When she speaks about a case publicly, she does so with the professional vocabulary of someone who has spent years building the analytical framework to back it up. When Jennifer Cadaver looked at the surveillance footage from Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home, specifically at the walkie-talkie visible in the image of the suspected individual at the front entrance, her assessment, reported by Newsweek, was direct and unambiguous. A walkie-talkie is not a solo instrument. Every person who has ever held one understands this instinctively. A walkie-talkie has no function in isolation. It exists to connect 2 points, to allow one person to speak and another person, positioned elsewhere, to respond. In the operational context of what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of January 31st into the early morning of February 1st, the presence of a two-way radio in the hands of the suspected individual at the front door means one thing: someone else was listening. Someone else was positioned at a different location, potentially inside the property, potentially near the back entrance, potentially in a vehicle on a nearby street, and that person was in active, real-time voice contact with the man removing the Nest camera from the front wall of an 84-year-old woman's home at 1:47 in the morning. Cadaver's analysis, as reported by Newsweek, described the walkie-talkie as evidence of coordinated, multi-person operation. The choice of a two-way radio over a phone is itself operationally significant. Phone calls generate records. They appear in carrier logs. They can be subpoenaed, traced, and mapped to cell towers that place a device at a specific location at a specific time. A walkie-talkie, operating on a radio frequency, generates none of those records. It leaves no digital footprint that a standard telecommunications subpoena can recover. The person who chose to carry a walkie-talkie to Nancy Guthrie's front door that night made that choice deliberately. They understood the difference between a phone call and a radio transmission. They understood which one was traceable and which one was not. That level of operational awareness is not accidental. It is planned. Former FBI Special Agent Steve Moore, speaking to journalist Brian Enton in his coverage of the case, offered a professional assessment of the suspected individual visible in the surveillance footage that at first appears to contradict the sophistication of the planning on display. Moore's judgment, the assessment of a man who spent years inside the FBI evaluating exactly this kind of behavioral and physical evidence, was that the suspected individual did not appear to operate from a background of professional training or experience in this kind of work. Read that carefully because the implication is more significant than it might initially appear. If the person on that camera was not a professional, if they did not come from a background in kidnapping, covert operations, or organized criminal enterprise, then the level of preparation visible in that surveillance footage did not come from expertise. It came from instruction. Someone told this person what to carry. Someone told them to use a radio instead of a phone. Someone told them the layout of the property, the camera positions, the timing of Nancy's Friday evening routine, the location of the unlocked back door. The walkie-talkie is not just evidence of a two-person operation. It is evidence of a directed operation. Someone, somewhere, was not just present on the other end of that radio, they may well have been the architect of everything the camera captured. And the man on the footage may have been precisely what the evidence increasingly suggests he was: the front. The visible element. The figure sent to the door that had a camera, to remove that camera, while the real operation proceeded through the entrance that had no camera and left no exterior record at all. In law enforcement terminology, there is a word for this role. Decoy. The man at the front door of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home, with his Walmart backpack and his chest holster and his flashlight and his two-way radio, was sent to the front of the house to be the story, while someone else became the truth. The walkie-talkie is behavioral evidence. It tells investigators what was likely happening. But behavioral evidence, in a federal criminal investigation, requires physical corroboration, something tangible, documented, and irreducible that confirms the inference. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, that corroboration came from inside the house. According to Sheriff Nanos, in an interview with NBC News on March 12, 2026, day 40 of the investigation, FBI forensic testing of the interior of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home identified a mixed DNA profile. The profile was drawn from biological material recovered from inside the residence. And it came from at least 2 individuals. Neither profile belonged to Nancy Guthrie. Neither profile matched any entry in the federal CODIS database. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, is the FBI's national repository of DNA profiles. It contains genetic samples collected from convicted offenders across the United States, from crime scene evidence in unsolved cases, and from missing persons investigations. It is one of the most comprehensive biological identification systems in the world. When a DNA profile recovered from a crime scene is run against CODIS and returns no match, it means one thing with precision. Neither of the 2 people whose biological material was found inside Nancy Guthrie's home has a prior conviction that generated a DNA sample in the federal system. 2 people. Neither of them Nancy. Neither of them known to federal law enforcement's existing genetic records. Both of them inside her home. The significance of this finding cannot be overstated, and it is worth sitting inside for a moment before moving forward. The early public narrative of this case, driven almost entirely by the circulation of the front door surveillance footage, presented a single individual as the central actor. One man. One image. One face that appeared in press briefings and news broadcasts and social media posts for weeks. The DNA evidence from inside the house does not support a single actor narrative. It never did. 2 people were inside Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home. The walkie-talkie confirmed active coordination between at least 2 individuals during the operation. The mixed DNA profile confirmed that at least 2 individuals physically entered the interior of the residence. These 2 pieces of evidence, drawn from entirely different forensic disciplines, behavioral analysis of surveillance footage on one side, biological trace evidence recovery on the other, point to the same conclusion independently. This was a coordinated, multi-person operation. And the man at the front door, the man whose image became the face of this case in the national media, accounts for only one of those 2 DNA profiles. The second profile, the person who came through the back who was never captured on any camera, who moved through the interior of an 84-year-old woman's home without leaving a genetic trace that connects them to any prior encounter with the federal criminal justice system, has no public image. No circulated photograph. No press conference mentioned by name. As of the most recent confirmed public reporting, the identity of the second individual inside Nancy Guthrie's home remains unknown. And the walkie-talkie was still transmitting when they were both inside. What were they coordinating? What did the operation require that demanded real-time communication between 2 people inside and around the property of an 84-year-old woman who could not walk 50 yards without assistance and whose medication was still on the counter and whose pacemaker had stopped syncing with her phone at 2:28 a.m.? The DNA evidence does not answer that question. But the ransom notes that arrived the following day contain something that does. Something so specific, so interior, so impossible to know from the outside of that property, that it points directly to a third element of this case that the surveillance footage and the DNA evidence together cannot fully explain. Someone had been inside that house before January 31st. The ransom notes did not arrive quietly. The first note was submitted through an online portal to KOL News 13 in Tucson on February 1, 2026. The same day Annie Guthrie called 911 and officers arrived at Nancy's home at 12:15 p.m. to find the front entrance blood-stained and her mother gone. The submission was confirmed by FBI Special Agent Heath Janicki. It was not a phone call. It was not a handwritten letter. It was a digital submission through a public-facing news tip portal to a local television station. More notes followed on February 2nd, sent to TMZ and to other media outlets. The demands contained in those notes were for $6 million. Payable in Bitcoin. A first deadline was set for February 5th. A second deadline for February 9th. But the dollar amount and the payment method and the deadlines are not what made those notes significant to the investigators who read them. What made those notes significant, what made FBI Special Agent Hythe Janicki confirm their receipt, and what made the FBI's analysis of their content a central thread of this investigation, were two specific details buried inside the language of the demand. The notes described the location of Nancy Guthrie's Apple Watch inside her home, and they referenced the broken floodlight at the back of her Tucson property. Read those two details slowly because the weight of what they represent does not land all at once. Nancy Guthrie's Apple Watch was inside her home. Not on a table visible through a window. Not in a location that someone standing on the sidewalk or the street or even in the yard could have observed. Inside a room, in a specific location, in the particular place where Nancy kept it, the kind of small personal detail that exists in the invisible geography of a person's daily life and is known only to the people who have been inside that space. The broken floodlight at the back of the property is, if anything, even more telling. A floodlight is an exterior fixture. But a broken one that has stopped functioning, is not something you confirm from the front of a house or from a street-level view of the property. You confirm it by being at the back of the house at night, when the light that should illuminate that area fails to come on. According to Sheriff Nanos and FBI Special Agent Hythe Janicki, as confirmed in reporting by KOL News 13 and TMZ, neither of these details had been released publicly by any law enforcement agency or any media outlet at the time the ransom notes arrived. Not the Apple Watch location. Not the broken floodlight. Neither. The only way to know where Nancy Guthrie kept her Apple Watch is to have been inside her home and to have been paying close enough attention to remember the specific location of a small personal device in a specific room. The only way to know that the floodlight at the back of her Tucson property was not functioning is to have been at the back of that property at night and to have noted that the light did not work. Both of those things require physical access. Not surveillance from across the street. Not a view through a window. Not a photograph taken from the sidewalk. Physical presence inside the home and at the back of the property, attentive enough and deliberate enough to register and retain those specific details for use in a document written after Nancy Guthrie was gone. This is the detail that the FBI agents focused on when they returned to Nancy's Tucson neighborhood on day 45 of the investigation. According to journalist Brian Enton, whose reporting on this case has been among the most sourced and consistent of any journalist covering it, agents did not return to the neighborhood on day 45 to canvass broadly, to ask neighbors about suspicious vehicles, or to revisit the surveillance footage from surrounding properties. They came back specifically to ask about contractors and cleaning crews. People who had been given documented access to homes in the surrounding area. People who had a reason to be inside. People who had been trusted enough to be left alone in a room, the kind of person who might see an Apple Watch on a surface and note its location, or walk to the back of a property and observe that the floodlight had stopped working. The logic embedded in that targeted line of questioning is direct and it is devastating. Investigators do not ask about contractors and cleaning crews unless they believe the interior knowledge displayed in those ransom notes came from someone who entered through the front door with a professional reason to be there. Not a burglar. Not a stranger who forced entry. Someone invited. Someone expected. Someone who moved through the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home without triggering any alarm, without leaving any visible sign of intrusion, because their presence there was not intrusion. It was access. Whoever wrote those ransom notes had been inside Nancy Guthrie's home before January 31, 2026. They knew what was on the counter. They knew what was in the room. They knew what was broken at the back of the property and where it was. And they used that knowledge to construct a document designed to look like a demand, while the FBI began the slow, methodical work of determining how a person with that level of interior knowledge came to possess it. Let us place the ransom note timeline in precise sequence, because the chronology matters as much as the content. February 1, 2026, KOL News 13, Tucson, Arizona. The first ransom note is submitted digitally through KOL News 13's online tip portal. The submission is confirmed by FBI Special Agent Hythe Janicki. The note demands $6 million in Bitcoin. It contains the interior details, the Apple Watch location, the broken floodlight, that law enforcement has not released publicly. A first deadline is set, February 5. February 2, 2026. TMZ and additional media outlets. Additional notes arrive. The demands are consistent. $6 million. Bitcoin. The same interior details. A second deadline is added, February 9th. At this point, law enforcement is managing two parallel realities simultaneously. On one side, Sheriff Nanos is making public statements, including his February 2 statement that there is no danger to the general community, a statement we will return to in Chapter 3, because it sits in direct and unresolved contradiction with everything his own investigation had already confirmed by that date. On the other side, FBI analysts are working through the content of those notes, identifying the interior details, and beginning the process of determining how the author came to possess that knowledge. February 5, 2026. First deadline passes. No payment has been made. No response from the family or law enforcement has been issued publicly. No proof of life has been provided by whoever sent the notes. No photograph of Nancy, no audio recording, no video, no verifiable communication of any kind establishing that she is alive and in someone's custody. The deadline passes in silence. February 9, 2026. Second deadline passes. No payment. No proof of life. No communication. The second deadline passes in the same silence as the first. Here is what every experienced hostage negotiator, every former kidnapping investigator, every person who has ever worked a ransom case at the federal level understands about what those two silent deadlines mean. In a functioning kidnap for ransom operation, the leverage is the victim. The demand only has force because the person making it can demonstrate on request that the victim is alive and in their control. Without proof of life, the demand is a document. It has no operational power. No family cooperates with a demand they cannot verify. No negotiator engages with a counterpart who cannot prove they hold what they claim to hold. Every genuine ransom case, every case in which a kidnapper is actually holding a living person and actually intends to negotiate for payment, produces proof of life. It is not optional. It is the mechanism by which the crime functions. Both deadlines in the Nancy Guthrie case passed without a single verifiable communication confirming she was alive. Not a photograph. Not a phone call. Not an audio clip. Nothing. Former FBI Deputy Director John Miller, speaking to CBS News, addressed this specific dimension of the case in terms that left no ambiguity about his professional interpretation. His assessment was that the crime may have gone wrong almost immediately after it began. He went further, stating that the ransom notes themselves may not have functioned as genuine demands at all. His position, as reported, was that the notes may have been written after an event had already concluded, constructed to build the appearance of an ongoing negotiation around a situation that was no longer ongoing. We will examine John Miller's full assessment, alongside the public conclusions of retired homicide detective Paul Celino and former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffin-Dafer, in Chapter 4. But it is important to introduce his read here, in the context of the ransom timeline, because the silence after both deadlines is the factual foundation on which his conclusion rests. Both deadlines passed. No proof of life. No communication. No negotiation. And on February 5, the same day the first deadline expired without response, federal agents made an arrest. It was the wrong person. On February 5, 2026, FBI agents arrested Derek Kalla, 42 years old, from Hawthorne, California. The arrest generated significant media attention. A suspect in custody on the day the first ransom deadline expired, in a case that had already consumed national news coverage for 5 days, it had the narrative shape of a break. A development. A case moving toward resolution. It was none of those things. Here is what Derek Kalla actually did, documented precisely as federal authorities described it. Kalla obtained the contact information for Annie Guthrie and her husband, Tommaso Cayan. He sent them ransom text messages using a VIP phone number, a service that masks the sender's identity by routing messages through a number that cannot be traced through standard carrier records. FBI agents traced those messages not through the phone number itself but through the Gmail account used in conjunction with the service. The account was registered in Kalla's name. Kalla was charged in connection with those fraudulent communications. According to federal authorities, Derek Kalla had no connection to Nancy Guthrie's actual disappearance. He had followed the case as it generated national coverage, absorbed the publicly available details, and made the decision to insert himself into the investigation by sending false ransom communications to the family of a missing 84-year-old woman. He was not the author of the notes sent to KOL News 13 and TMZ. He did not know about the Apple Watch. He did not know about the broken floodlight. He had not been inside Nancy Guthrie's home. He was, in the language of investigators who have worked cases like this, a case exploiter, someone who attaches themselves to a high-profile situation for reasons that range from financial opportunism to psychological compulsion, and his arrest, while legally appropriate, contributed nothing to the central investigation. The person who had written the real notes was not Derek Kalla. The person who knew where Nancy's Apple Watch sat in that room, who knew the floodlight at the back of the property was broken, who had been inside that house and retained those specific details precisely enough to include them in a document sent to a news station. That person remained unidentified on February 5th. And both ransom deadlines had now passed in silence. The FBI had an arrest. The arrest was real and the charges were legitimate. But the arrest answered nothing about what had happened inside Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home on the night of January 31st. The decoy at the front door was still unidentified. The second DNA profile from inside the house was still unmatched. The walkie-talkie's second party was still unknown. The back door was still the detail that the national coverage had not yet fully addressed. And the person with interior knowledge of Nancy's home, the person who knew what was on her counter and what was broken at the back of her property, was still out there. Derek Kalla was in custody. And the case had not moved an inch closer to Nancy Guthrie. What you have just heard, the walkie-talkie, the two DNA profiles, the interior knowledge in those ransom notes, the arrest that changed nothing, is not in the mainstream coverage of this case. Most people who followed Nancy Guthrie's disappearance in the news cycle were told about Derek Kalla's arrest and moved on. They were not told that the real author of the ransom notes is still unidentified. They were not told that two unmatched DNA profiles sit inside a federal investigation with no names attached to them. You know it because you are here. But if you are not subscribed to Cold Case Files USA, the next development, the one where those DNA profiles get names, where the walkie-talkie's second party is identified, where the sheriff says what he has known since day one, will not reach you. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications. The people with something to hide are counting on you staying uninformed. Do not make it easy for them. 2 ransom deadlines. Both passed in silence. No photograph of Nancy Guthrie. No phone call. No audio. No verifiable communication of any kind confirming that an 84-year-old woman who cannot walk 50 yards without assistance, who takes daily heart medication, who has a pacemaker embedded in her chest that had stopped syncing with her phone at 2:28 in the morning, confirming that she was alive and in someone's custody and capable of being returned. Nothing. Just 2 dates on a calendar, February 5th and February 9th, that came and went while the family of Nancy Guthrie waited, and the FBI worked, and the national media covered Derek Kalla's arrest as though it were progress, and the real author of those notes, the person who knew about the Apple Watch and the broken floodlight, remained where they had been since the night the garage door came down. Unidentified. Unaccountable. Unlocated. Think about what Nancy Guthrie's February looked like from the outside of this investigation. Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, was on national television every morning, one of the most recognized faces in American media, while the mother she had moved to Tucson to be near was gone. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Cain, the last confirmed person to see her alive, was living inside an investigation that had already returned agents to the neighborhood asking targeted questions about contractors and cleaning crews. Her medication was still on the counter. Her Apple Watch was still where the person who wrote those notes knew it would be. And somewhere in the distance between 2 silent ransom deadlines and 2 unmatched DNA profiles, the investigation was turning toward the question that neither the front door surveillance footage nor the arrest of Derek Kalla had come any closer to answering. Who gave them the inside information? Not the man with the backpack. Not Derek Kalla in Hawthorne, California. The person with actual interior knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's home, knowledge that required physical access, attentiveness, and deliberate retention. The person who knew what was in the room and what was broken at the back of the property. The person who, in the judgment of investigators, came through the front door with a reason to be there. On February 2, 2026, one day after investigators found Nancy Guthrie's blood at the front entrance of her Tucson home, one day after ransom notes arrived at KOL News 13 describing interior details of her house that no outsider should have known, one day after DNA analysis confirmed the blood belonged to an 84-year-old woman who could not walk unassisted and whose daily heart medication was still sitting on her counter, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos stood before the public and said the following. There was no danger to the community. The public could stand down. There was nothing for the residents of Tucson to worry about. Now hold that statement in your mind. Hold it exactly as he delivered it. And then place it next to what the same man said on March 12, 2026, 40 days later, in an interview with NBC News. On March 12, Sheriff Chris Nanos told NBC News that he had understood the motive in this case from the very first day of the investigation. He did not share the motive. He also stated in that same interview that the person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance might commit a similar crime again. Read those 2 statements together. Not separately. Together. On February 2, No danger to the community. On March 12, the suspect may strike again. These are not two positions that exist in tension with each other. They are not two perspectives shaped by evolving information. They are a direct, documentable contradiction between what Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos told the public on day 2 of this investigation and what he told NBC News 40 days later. And the distance between them is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of record. Sheriff Nanos has never publicly addressed that distance. No press conference. No clarifying statement. No explanation of how a case with no danger to the community on February 2 became a case involving a suspect who might target someone again by March 12. What sits inside that gap, between those two statements across those 40 days, is not just a contradiction. It is the story of an investigation that, from its earliest hours, made a series of decisions that experienced federal investigators would later describe publicly, on the record, with their names attached, as some of the most damaging institutional failures they had ever seen in a case of this magnitude. This is Chapter 3. And this is the second crime committed in the Nancy Guthrie case, not by the man at the front door, not by the person whose DNA is unmatched in the federal database, but by the office that was supposed to find them. In any missing persons investigation, the last confirmed person to see the victim is a foundational fact. It is one of the first questions law enforcement establishes, documents, and locks into the official record, because the answer to that question shapes every subsequent line of inquiry. Who drove Nancy Guthrie home on the night of January 31, 2026 is not an ambiguous question. It is a factual question with a documentable answer. The surveillance footage from Nancy's Tucson property captured the vehicle arriving at 9:48 p.m. The garage door closed at 9:50. The answer to who was in that car was recorded on camera. Sheriff Chris Nanos gave 4 different public answers to that question. According to reporting by journalist Brian Enton, whose coverage of the Nancy Guthrie case has been among the most consistently sourced of any journalist working the story, Nanos initially indicated that Annie Guthrie had driven her mother home that night. Then he indicated it had been both Annie and Tommaso Cayan together. Then he attributed the drive solely to Tommaso Cayan. 3 different answers to the same question, a question the surveillance footage had already answered, delivered across multiple public statements by the lead investigator on a federal missing persons case. And then, according to Brian Enton's reporting, Nanos instructed his communications team to stop specifying who drove Nancy home. The directive was to use the word family as a catch-all answer going forward. Not Annie. Not Tommaso. Not both. Family. A deliberate instruction to introduce vagueness into a confirmed fact. Understand what this means in practice. When a reporter asks who drove the missing person home on the night she disappeared and the lead investigator's office responds with the word family, not because the answer is unknown, not because the surveillance footage is unclear, but because the lead investigator has directed his communications team to stop being specific, that is not a communication strategy. That is a decision to manage information rather than release it. Brian Enton's reporting on this specific contradiction was not a peripheral detail in his coverage. It was a signal, one that experienced investigators watching the case from the outside recognized immediately, that the Pima County Sheriff's Office was treating the public dissemination of confirmed facts as a variable to be controlled rather than a responsibility to be honored. In a federal kidnapping investigation where public information can generate tips, where a witness who saw a vehicle in a neighborhood needs to know whose vehicle to look for, where the family of a missing person depends on the clarity of official communications to maintain their own orientation to the case, the deliberate substitution of a vague collective noun for a confirmed individual name is not a neutral act. It has consequences. Real ones. Measurable ones. And the driver contradiction was only the first in a pattern. The pattern that followed, the DNA lab decision, the crime scene release, the gap between what Nanos said publicly and what the FBI was doing on the ground, would be documented, named, and condemned by people who have spent their careers building federal investigations and who recognize from the outside what a compromised one looks like from the inside. But before we get to those assessments, we need to address the decision that drew the most direct and sustained professional condemnation of any single action taken in the first weeks of this investigation. The decision about where to send the DNA. Because that decision, made in the earliest hours of a federal missing persons case, in a home where investigators had already confirmed the presence of blood belonging to a missing 84-year-old woman, did not just damage the public credibility of the Pima County Sheriff's Office. It damaged the case itself. And in a criminal investigation, a damaged case is not an administrative problem. It is a gift to every defense attorney who will ever sit across a table from a prosecutor and ask why the evidence was handled the way it was. When forensic investigators collected biological evidence from the interior of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home, the mixed DNA profile from at least 2 unidentified individuals confirmed by Sheriff Nanos in his March 12 NBC News interview, there was a clear, established, federally recognized protocol for where that evidence should go. It should have gone to the FBI's laboratory at Quantico, Virginia. The FBI laboratory at Quantico is not simply a well-resourced forensic facility. It is the national standard for criminal evidence processing in federal cases. It maintains the CODIS database. It has the infrastructure, the chain of custody protocols, the legal standing, and the institutional relationships to process evidence in a way that is immediately usable in federal prosecution. When a case involves a federal crime, and the kidnapping of Nancy Guthrie from the earliest confirmed hours of the investigation was being treated as a federal matter, the DNA evidence collected from the crime scene goes to Quantico. That is the protocol. It exists for reasons that are not bureaucratic. They are legal, evidentiary, and strategic. Sheriff Chris Nanos sent the DNA to DNA Labs International. DNA Labs International is a private forensic laboratory operating out of Florida. It is a legitimate commercial forensic facility. It processes DNA evidence. It produces results. In certain contexts, civil matters, private legal proceedings, cases that do not involve federal prosecution, it is an appropriate choice. In a federal kidnapping investigation involving a missing 84-year-old woman, 2 unidentified DNA profiles, and a crime scene that had already attracted the involvement of FBI special agents and federal prosecutors, it was not an appropriate choice. The response from sources inside federal law enforcement was, by any standard of professional commentary, unsparing. Across multiple outlets covering the case, the decision to route the DNA evidence to a private Florida laboratory rather than the FBI's Quantico facility was described in language that left no ambiguity about how the federal law enforcement community viewed it. The decision made no sense in the context of a federal kidnapping investigation. All results from DNA Labs International would need to be retested from the beginning before they could be used in a federal prosecution. The chain of custody established by the private lab submission was not the chain of custody that federal evidentiary standards require. That last point is the one with the longest reach. Chain of custody in a criminal case is not a formality. It is the documented, unbroken record of where a piece of evidence has been, who has handled it, and under what conditions it has been stored from the moment it was collected at the crime scene to the moment it is presented in court. Any gap in that chain, any handling of evidence outside the established federal protocol, creates an opening. It creates a question that a defense attorney can ask in front of a jury. It creates a basis for challenging the admissibility of evidence that might otherwise be decisive. By sending the DNA from Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home to DNA Labs International instead of the FBI laboratory at Quantico, the Pima County Sheriff's Office created exactly that opening in the evidentiary architecture of a federal kidnapping case. Nanos offered a public explanation for the decision. He stated that his preference was to maintain all evidence under a unified chain of custody in a single location, implying that routing the DNA to the FBI's Quantico facility rather than keeping it under the Sheriff's Office's own contracted laboratory relationship would have fragmented the evidence management process. The FBI did not accept that explanation as reasonable. Federal law enforcement sources, speaking to multiple outlets covering the case, made clear that in a federal investigation of this nature, the FBI laboratory is not an alternative option to be weighed against a private facility. It is the designated, protocol-mandated destination for biological evidence. And the mandatory retesting requirement that the DNA Labs International submission created was not a minor administrative inconvenience. It was a delay. In a case where an 84-year-old woman with a heart condition and a daily medication requirement was missing and unaccounted for, the retesting requirement created a delay in the production of usable DNA evidence that could identify the 2 individuals who had been inside her home. That delay had a cost. What that cost ultimately amounted to, whether it altered the trajectory of the investigation in a way that cannot be recovered, is a question that the full record of this case will eventually have to answer. What is answerable right now is this. The decision was made, it was condemned by federal law enforcement sources on the record, and it was not the last decision in the first days of this investigation that drew that level of professional criticism. The blood at the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home was found by investigators who arrived at 12:15 p.m. on February 1, 2026. The drops were round. They fell vertically, straight down, in the pattern that forensic analysts associate with a stationary source. A person standing still, bleeding downward rather than moving through the space. There were no footprints interspersed between the drops. DNA analysis confirmed the blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. This was a primary crime scene in a federal kidnapping investigation involving confirmed biological evidence of a violent event at the entrance of the victim's residence. In under 20 hours it was released. News crews filmed the blood at the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's home. The footage circulated. The images were broadcast. And the forensic processing of a crime scene that investigators had confirmed contained evidence central to a federal kidnapping case was, by the standard of every experienced investigator who commented on it publicly, not complete at the time of release. Sheriff Nanos later acknowledged the decision directly. His words, as reported across multiple outlets covering the case, were, "Monday morning quarterback." A concession, framed as retrospective self-criticism, that the release of the crime scene had been premature. That the decision, reviewed in hindsight, was not the right one. But the acknowledgement arrived after the fact had already been recorded. The crime scene had been released. The news crews had filmed it. The blood at the entrance of Nancy Guthrie's home had been broadcast to a national audience before the forensic processing was complete. And no amount of retrospective acknowledgement could restore the evidentiary integrity of a primary crime scene that had been returned to public access before investigators finished working it. Dr. Michael Bell and FBI profiler Jim Clementi, whose analyses of the physical evidence at Nancy's home were reported across multiple outlets, both addressed the significance of the blood evidence in detail. The vertical drop pattern. The stationary source implication. The DNA confirmation. These were not peripheral details in the forensic record of this case. They were among the most significant physical evidence findings of the entire investigation. And they were collected from a crime scene that was released in under 20 hours. Consider the full picture that was now assembled by the end of the first week of this investigation. DNA evidence had been sent to a private Florida laboratory rather than the FBI's Quantico facility, requiring mandatory retesting before it could be used in federal prosecution. The primary crime scene had been released before forensic processing was complete. The lead investigator had given 4 different public answers about the last confirmed person to see the missing woman alive and had then instructed his communications team to stop being specific. 3 decisions. Each one documentable. Each one condemned by experienced investigators who spoke publicly about the case. And each one made in the first days of an investigation into the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman whose pacemaker had stopped syncing with her phone at 2:28 in the morning and whose blood was at her own front door. The professionals who watched those decisions from the outside did not stay silent about what they saw. 2 of them, in particular, placed their assessments on the public record in terms that reflected the full weight of their combined institutional experience. The first was a retired deputy sheriff with years of direct experience in cases of exactly this kind. The second was a former FBI supervisory special agent whose career had taken him to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Both of them said publicly what the documented record of those first days supports entirely. And neither of them was gentle about it. Richard Castaner Jr. is a retired deputy sheriff. His career was built on the institutional knowledge that accumulates over years of managing investigations at the county level. The practical, operational understanding of how a major case should be run, who should be running it, and at what point the complexity of a federal matter exceeds the capacity of a county sheriff's office to manage alone. When Richard Castaner Jr. spoke to the Daily Mail about the Nancy Guthrie investigation, he did not speak in hedged or diplomatic language. He said what the record supported, and he said it with the directness of someone whose professional credibility does not depend on maintaining a comfortable relationship with the Pima County Sheriff's Office. His assessment was that jurisdiction over the Nancy Guthrie investigation should have been formally transferred to the FBI at least 2 weeks before it was. 2 weeks. In a federal kidnapping case. 2 weeks of investigative time during which the case should have been operating under FBI protocols, FBI resources, and FBI laboratory standards. But was not, because the formal transfer of jurisdiction had not yet occurred. Castaner described Sheriff Chris Nanos in the Daily Mail interview as a classic micromanager. That characterization, delivered by a retired law enforcement professional with direct institutional knowledge of how county sheriff's offices function and how they interact with federal agencies, carried a specific implication that went beyond the label itself. A micromanager in law enforcement does not simply slow down administrative processes. A micromanager in law enforcement makes decisions about evidence handling, public communications, and jurisdictional cooperation that are driven by a desire to maintain personal control over the case rather than by the investigative best practices that the case requires. The driver contradiction, 4 different answers, the instruction to use the word family, is the behavioral signature of exactly that dynamic. The DNA lab decision, routing evidence to a private Florida facility rather than Quantico to keep the evidence under the sheriff's office's own chain of custody, is another. Castaner's characterization was not an emotional assessment. It was a professional diagnosis, offered by someone who recognized the pattern from experience. And the delayed transfer of jurisdiction was not simply a procedural inconvenience in the abstract. Every day that the Nancy Guthrie investigation operated outside full FBI jurisdiction was a day during which the decisions being made about evidence, communications, and investigative direction were being made by an office that, in the professional judgment of a retired deputy sheriff with direct institutional knowledge of these dynamics, should no longer have been making them. The FBI eventually took full operational control of the investigation. But the decisions made in the period before that transfer, the DNA lab routing, the crime scene release, the driver contradiction, the public statements that contradicted the ground-level reality of what agents were doing, were already part of the record by the time federal protocols were fully in place. Richard Castaner Jr. put that reality on the public record in the Daily Mail. He was not the only one. James Gagliano is a former FBI supervisory special agent. He did not spend his career at the county level. He spent it inside the bureau, at the supervisory level, building and overseeing the kind of federal investigations that the Nancy Guthrie case was supposed to be from the moment investigators found blood at her front door and ransom notes arrived at a Tucson news station. When James Gagliano spoke about the Nancy Guthrie case, not to a single outlet but to both Fox News and CNN separately on the record, he used two words to describe it that every experienced investigator in his audience understood immediately: red hot. In the professional vocabulary of federal law enforcement, a red-hot case is not simply a high-profile one. It is a case with active evidentiary leads, confirmed forensic findings, and an investigative trajectory that is moving. A case where the evidence is still warm, where the operational window has not yet closed, where the right decisions in the right sequence can still produce the outcome the victim's family needs. A red-hot case demands the best institutional response available. It demands federal protocols, federal resources, and federal laboratory standards applied from the first confirmed hours of the investigation. It demands that the people making decisions about evidence, communications, and investigative direction understand the stakes of every choice they make in those earliest hours, because those choices shape everything that follows. James Gagliano directed pointed, on-record criticism at how information had been shaped and released in official communications from the Pima County Sheriff's Office. The word shaped is doing significant work in that sentence and it deserves direct attention. There is a difference between information being managed, withheld from the public for legitimate operational reasons, released on a schedule that protects the integrity of the investigation, and information being shaped. Shaped implies construction. It implies that the information released to the public was not simply curated for operational protection but crafted for a specific effect. A specific public impression that may or may not have corresponded to the investigative reality on the ground. Gagliano's criticism was not directed at operational information management. It was directed at the shaping of public communications from the office leading a federal kidnapping investigation. That is a significant distinction, made by a man whose career was built on understanding exactly that difference. Both Castaner and Gagliano spoke publicly, with their names attached. After reviewing the same documented record that this chapter has now laid out, the driver contradiction, the DNA lab decision, the crime scene release, the February 2 no danger statement that would be directly contradicted by the March 12 NBC interview. Two experienced law enforcement professionals from different institutional backgrounds, looking at the same documented record and arriving at the same conclusion. The investigation of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was not being run the way a case of this magnitude required. And the consequences of that gap between what the investigation required and what it received were not abstract. They were evidentiary. They were documentary. And they were, as James Gagliano noted publicly, the kind that experienced defense attorneys study carefully. On a date that has not been specified precisely in public reporting but falls within the first weeks of the investigation, Sheriff Chris Nanos told reporters and the public that investigators did not have a name for the person seen in the surveillance footage from Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home. No name. No identification. The investigation was working from a physical description and a surveillance image, and the lead investigator's public position was that the identity of the suspected individual remained unknown. At the same time, according to Brian Enton's reporting on the ground-level activity of the investigation, FBI agents were visiting local businesses in the area. They were showing photographs to employees. And they were asking those employees a specific question. Do you recognize this person? Read those two realities together. Publicly, no name, no identification, the image is being circulated in hopes that the public can help. On the ground, federal agents are presenting photographs of a specific individual to specific employees at specific businesses and asking those employees to confirm whether they recognize the face. You do not show a photograph to a business employee and ask if they recognize the person in it unless you have a reasonable belief about who that person is. You do not conduct targeted location-specific photographic identification inquiries unless you have moved beyond the stage where the identity is entirely unknown. The investigative action of showing a photograph to a potential witness and asking for confirmation is, by its nature, an action taken toward a name, not away from one. Saying there is no name while simultaneously presenting photographs to potential witnesses for identification is not a nuance in public communication strategy. It is a direct contradiction between what was being told to the public and what was being done on the ground. Brian Enton's reporting on this gap was specific and sourced. It was not an inference or an editorial interpretation. It was a documented contrast between two simultaneous realities in the same investigation: the public-facing reality shaped and released by the Pima County Sheriff's Office, and the operational reality being conducted by FBI agents asking people at local businesses whether they recognized a face. Former FBI and CIA officer Tracy Walder, who provided analytical commentary on the case across multiple outlets, addressed the structural implications of this kind of public operational gap directly. Her observation was pointed. When the public-facing statements of a lead investigator consistently diverge from the operational reality of what investigators are doing on the ground, the divergence itself becomes an investigative question. Not just a communications problem. A question. Why does the lead investigator of a federal kidnapping case consistently present a public version of the investigation that does not match what the investigation is actually doing? That question does not have a single answer. It is possible that the divergence reflects legitimate operational security, a deliberate decision to withhold from the public information that, if released, would compromise active investigative threats. That is a defensible rationale, even if the execution in this case, 4 different answers about the driver, the Monday morning quarterback crime scene release, the Florida DNA lab, does not reflect the discipline that legitimate operational security typically requires. It is also possible that the divergence reflects something else. Something that James Gagliano was gesturing toward when he used the word shaped. Something that Richard Castaner Jr. was describing when he used the phrase classic micromanager. Something that the accumulation of documented contradictions in the Pima County Sheriff's Office's handling of this case invites, but does not yet confirm, as a question worth asking. Whatever the explanation, the public operational gap in the Nancy Guthrie investigation was real. It was documented. It was reported by a named journalist with named sources. And it sat alongside every other documented failure of the first weeks of this investigation as part of a pattern that experienced federal investigators recognized and condemned publicly. An 84-year-old woman was missing. The blood at her door was hers. 2 unidentified people's DNA was inside her home. The sheriff knew the motive from day one and wasn't saying it. And the investigation that was supposed to find her kept looking the other way. James Gagliano ran federal investigations at the supervisory level inside the FBI. Richard Castaner Jr. spent a career in law enforcement building exactly the kind of institutional knowledge that lets you recognize when a case is being mismanaged. Both of them went on record. With their names. In national outlets. Most people following this case have never heard what they said laid out in one place. That is what this channel exists to do. If you are reading this in the comments right now and you have not subscribed, we want to hear from you. Tell us what is stopping you. Tell us what reason exists to stay disconnected from a case where an 84-year-old woman is still missing, 2 unidentified DNA profiles are sitting inside a federal investigation with no names attached, and the man leading that investigation confirmed on NBC News that he has known the motive since day one and still hasn't said what it is. Drop it in the comments. We are reading every single one. Here is what the documented record of the first weeks of the Nancy Guthrie investigation establishes. The DNA from inside her home was sent to a private Florida laboratory instead of the FBI's Quantico facility. The crime scene was released in under 20 hours. The lead investigator gave 4 different public answers about the last person to see her alive and then instructed his team to stop being specific. He told the public there was no danger to the community one day after finding her blood at the door. He confirmed 40 days later that he had known the motive since the beginning and that the suspect might strike again. And while he was presenting a public version of the investigation that consistently diverged from its operational reality, FBI agents were on the ground showing photographs to local business employees and returning to the neighborhood on day 45 to ask targeted questions about contractors and cleaning crews who had been inside homes in the area. The investigation was moving. But the part of it that was moving, the targeted, methodical, forensically grounded federal investigation, was moving despite the decisions made in the first hours, not because of them. Richard Castaner Jr. said jurisdiction should have transferred to the FBI 2 weeks earlier than it did. James Gagliano said the information coming from the sheriff's office had been shaped. The mandatory DNA retesting requirement was already in place. The crime scene was already released. And Nancy Guthrie was still missing. 46 days after the garage door of her Tucson home closed at 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, there was no confirmed proof of life. No photograph. No phone call. No verifiable communication. The 2 ransom deadlines had passed in silence. The arrest of Derek Kalla had changed nothing about the central investigation. The 2 DNA profiles from inside her home remained unmatched. And the 3 most credentialed voices to publicly examine this case, a former FBI deputy director, a veteran homicide detective, and a former FBI special agent who had spent her career reading exactly this kind of evidence, had each arrived independently at a conclusion about what the silence after those 2 ransom deadlines actually meant. Their conclusion was not that Nancy Guthrie was still being held somewhere. Their conclusion was something the mainstream coverage of this case had not yet said directly. On March 10, 2026, former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffendafer posted publicly. Not to a journalist. Not in an interview. Not in a press statement coordinated with law enforcement. She posted publicly, in the way that a person posts when they have reached a conclusion they are prepared to stand behind, when the weight of what they know has moved past the point where staying quiet is professionally defensible. She wrote that the search phase of the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was over. She wrote that the situation was half glass full. And then she offered no further elaboration. 2 sentences. Chosen by a woman who spent her career inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where the professional discipline of weighing language before committing it to the record is not a preference. It is a survival skill. Every word in a federal investigation means something precise. Every public statement made by someone with institutional credibility in an active case carries weight that extends beyond the moment of its delivery. Jennifer Coffendafer knew exactly what she was writing when she wrote those 2 sentences. She knew what the people in the law enforcement community who follow her would understand from them. And she posted them anyway. The search phase is over. Half glass full. Think carefully about what those 2 phrases mean in combination. The search phase of a missing persons investigation is the phase during which investigators operate under the assumption, however diminishing, that the missing person may still be alive and locatable. It is the phase during which cadaver dogs are deployed, aerial searches are conducted, waterways and open land are examined, and every resource available to law enforcement is directed toward the possibility that the person who is gone might still be found breathing. When the search phase ends, it ends because the people conducting it have reached a professional judgment about what the available evidence supports. Half glass full is not the language of someone describing an ongoing rescue operation. It is the language of someone who has looked at what the evidence shows and arrived at the most honest framing they are willing to offer publicly about a case that has not yet produced a confirmed answer. Jennifer Coffendafer posted those 2 sentences on March 10, 2026. 2 days before Sheriff Chris Nanos sat down with NBC News and confirmed that he had known the motive in this case since the very first day of the investigation. She was not guessing. She was not speculating. She was communicating, in the precise, weighted language of someone who reads crime scenes for a living, what the professional consensus inside the law enforcement community had already reached. And she was not alone. Before we go to the individual assessments of John Miller, Paul Celino, and Jennifer Coffendafer, we need to establish the structural foundation on which all 3 of their conclusions rest. Because their skepticism about the conventional kidnapping narrative in the Nancy Guthrie case is not an emotional response to a disturbing set of facts. It is a logical conclusion drawn from a single operational reality that every person who has ever worked a ransom case at the federal level understands completely. In a kidnap for ransom operation, proof of life is not optional. This is not a procedural preference. It is not a negotiating courtesy. It is the mechanism by which the entire crime functions. The demand has force only because the person making it can demonstrate, on request, verifiably, in a form that the family and law enforcement can confirm, that the victim is alive and in their custody. Without that demonstration, the demand is a document. It has no leverage. It has no operational power. It cannot compel a family to cooperate, a negotiator to engage, or a financial institution to facilitate a transfer. Every functioning kidnap for ransom case in the documented history of federal law enforcement produces proof of life. Every one. Not most. Every one. Because without it, the crime does not work. The architecture of ransom depends entirely on the credible, verifiable demonstration that the leverage is real. Proof of life takes different forms in different cases. A photograph of the victim holding a current newspaper. A brief phone call in which the victim speaks. An audio recording that can be verified by voice analysis. A video. Any of these. Any form of verifiable communication that establishes, beyond reasonable doubt, that the person being ransomed is alive and in the custody of the person making the demand. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the first ransom deadline was February 5, 2026. The second was February 9. Between the arrival of the first ransom note on February 1 and the passing of the second deadline on February 9, an 8-day window, the people who sent those notes produced zero proof of life. Not a photograph. Not a phone call. Not an audio recording. Not a video. Not a single verifiable communication of any kind establishing that Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman with a heart condition, a pacemaker, and a daily medication requirement, was alive and in someone's custody and capable of being returned in exchange for $6 million in Bitcoin. Both deadlines passed in complete silence. And then there was nothing. No escalation of the demand. No extension of the deadline with conditions attached. No communication explaining the silence. No proof of life provided after the deadlines had expired as a demonstration that the leverage still existed. In a functioning ransom negotiation, silence after a deadline is not a strategy. Experienced negotiators do not go silent after a deadline passes. They escalate. They communicate. They demonstrate that the leverage is real. They do this because without that demonstration, the negotiation ends and the crime loses its operational purpose. The silence after February 9, 2026 was not a negotiating posture. It was an absence. And the three most credentialed voices to publicly examine the Nancy Guthrie case, drawing on combined decades of federal law enforcement experience at the highest levels of the Bureau and in homicide investigation, looked at that absence and arrived at the same professional conclusion. The silence was not the silence of a kidnapper waiting for the right moment. It was the silence of someone who had nothing left to prove. John Miller said it first. He said it to CBS News. He said it with the full weight of a career that took him to the position of Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And what he said, the specific professional assessment he offered on the record about the ransom notes in the Nancy Guthrie case, is the sentence that this entire chapter has been building toward. John Miller is not a television commentator. He is not a former law enforcement official who transitioned into media work and now offers analysis calibrated for broadcast palatability. His career is a specific, documented record of institutional service at the highest levels of American federal law enforcement. He served as Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Before that, he served as Assistant Director of the FBI's Office of Public Affairs. He has held senior positions in the New York City Police Department and in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He has spent decades inside the institutional machinery of American law enforcement, at the level where the decisions that shape federal investigations are actually made, not discussed, not analyzed retrospectively, but made in real time with real consequences. When John Miller speaks about a case publicly, he speaks from that specific institutional position. His assessments are not the product of news cycle analysis. They are the product of a career spent building exactly the kind of professional judgment that allows someone to look at a documented evidentiary record and say with confidence what it shows. John Miller spoke to CBS News about the Nancy Guthrie case. His assessment was direct and it was unhedged. He told CBS News that in his professional judgment, the crime went wrong almost immediately after it began. Read that sentence with the weight it carries from the person who said it. The crime went wrong almost immediately. Not eventually. Not as negotiations broke down over days or weeks. Almost immediately, in the earliest moments of whatever happened inside Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home after the garage door closed at 9:50 p.m. on January 31, 2026. That assessment, from a former FBI deputy director, is not a television observation. It is a professional conclusion drawn from the specific evidentiary record of the case. The two DNA profiles with no CODIS match, the walkie-talkie indicating coordination, the blood at the front entrance in a vertical drop pattern consistent with a stationary source, the Pacemaker sink dropping at 2:28 a.m., and the ransom notes that arrived the following day containing interior details that required physical access to the home to possess. But Miller did not stop there. He extended his analysis to the ransom notes themselves, the notes confirmed by FBI Special Agent Hythe Janicki, the notes that demanded $6 million in Bitcoin, the notes that knew where Nancy's Apple Watch was and that the floodlight at the back of the property was broken. The notes that produced 2 deadlines and 2 silences and not a single verifiable proof of life. John Miller's professional assessment of those notes, as reported by CBS News, was this: they may not have functioned as genuine ransom demands at all. His position, stated on the record with his name attached, to one of the largest news organizations in the United States, was that the ransom notes in the Nancy Guthrie case may have been produced after an event had already occurred. Not as a demand for payment in exchange for a living person's safe return. As a construction. A document designed to build the appearance of an ongoing kidnapping negotiation around a situation that had already reached its conclusion, to redirect investigators, to redirect the family, and to redirect the public from what had actually happened toward a story of negotiation still in progress. A cover. The ransom notes, in John Miller's professional assessment, may have been a cover story. Not the operative communication of people who had Nancy Guthrie and intended to return her. A narrative construction, produced after the fact, designed to obscure what had actually happened inside that house on the night of January 31st. The implications of that assessment, if it is accurate, are significant enough to require a moment of direct attention. If the ransom notes were written after an event had already concluded, if they were constructed to create the appearance of an ongoing negotiation rather than to facilitate one, then the investigation of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was, from the moment those notes arrived at KOL News 13 on February 1st, being conducted partly in response to a fiction. Every resource directed toward the ransom negotiation framework, every analysis of the Bitcoin demand, every examination of the deadline structure, every conversation about whether the family should respond, was being directed toward a story that the people who wrote the notes knew was not the real story. And the real story, whatever happened inside that house between 9:50 p.m. on January 31st and the moment the FBI arrived at 12:15 p.m. on February 1st, was moving in a different direction entirely while investigators worked inside the fiction. John Miller said this publicly, with his name, to CBS News. He was not alone in that conclusion. Paul Celino is a veteran homicide detective. His career has not been built in the conference rooms of federal agencies or in the institutional architecture of the Bureau. It has been built at crime scenes, in the specific, physical, irreducible discipline of reading what a scene shows and what it is designed to conceal. Homicide investigation is not about theories. It is about evidence. It is about the gap between the story a scene appears to tell and the story the physical record actually supports. Paul Celino looked at the documented physical record of what happened at Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home on the night of January 31, 2026, and he spoke to the New York Post. His conclusion was delivered without qualification, without hedging, and without the careful institutional language that former federal officials tend to deploy when speaking publicly about active investigations. He said, "I don't think she was kidnapped." 5 words. Placed on the public record by a veteran homicide detective in the New York Post, in a case that every law enforcement authority with a public platform had been treating as a kidnapping since the ransom notes arrived on February 1st. I don't think she was kidnapped. That sentence is not a casual opinion. It is a professional conclusion reached by someone whose career has been built on distinguishing between what a crime scene is meant to look like and what the physical evidence actually shows. Paul Celino has spent years in exactly the discipline that requires a person to ask at every crime scene they work. What is this scene designed to make me believe and what does the evidence actually support? His answer, applied to the Nancy Guthrie case, was that the evidence does not support the kidnapping framework. Place his conclusion alongside John Miller's. 2 people. 2 entirely different professional backgrounds and institutional positions. Miller came from the top of the FBI's administrative hierarchy, the Office of the Deputy Director, where federal investigations are shaped at the policy level. Celino came from the ground level of homicide investigation, the crime scene, the physical evidence, the detective's discipline of reading what is real against what is presented. Both of them looked at the same documented record. Both of them arrived at the same place. The ransom notes produced 2 deadlines and 2 silences. No proof of life. No escalation. No negotiation. No verifiable communication of any kind establishing that Nancy Guthrie was alive and in someone's custody on February 5th or February 9th or any day between those dates and the present. In Paul Celino's professional judgment, the judgment of a man who has spent his career knowing the difference between a kidnapping and something constructed to look like one, this does not look like a kidnapping. And the specific physical elements of the Nancy Guthrie case that most directly support his conclusion are not the ransom notes or the silent deadlines. They are the elements from inside the house. The blood at the front entrance falling in a vertical drop pattern from a stationary source. The mixed DNA from two individuals neither of whom appears in the federal criminal database. The pacemaker that stopped syncing with the phone at 2:28 in the morning. The Apple Watch left on the counter. The medication left on the counter. These are not the physical signatures of a coordinated abduction that went according to plan. They are, in the professional assessment of a veteran homicide detective who put his conclusion on the public record without qualification, the physical signatures of something that went wrong. Something that required a cover story. And the ransom notes, with their interior details and their Bitcoin demands and their deadlines that passed in absolute silence, were the cover story. Paul Celino said so in the New York Post. John Miller had already said the same thing to CBS News. And Jennifer Coffendafer, the former FBI special agent who had first identified the walkie-talkie as evidence of a coordinated multi-person operation, had been moving toward the same conclusion since the earliest days of the investigation. Jennifer Coffendafer's contribution to the public understanding of the Nancy Guthrie case did not begin with her March 10 post declaring the search phase over. It began earlier, in the analytical work she did on the surveillance footage from Nancy's front entrance. Work that was reported by Newsweek and that established the foundational evidentiary argument for the multi-person operation theory. Her analysis of the walkie-talkie was the first public professional assessment to directly challenge the single-actor narrative that the circulation of the front door surveillance footage had created in the national media. A walkie-talkie, she stated, is not a solo instrument. The person carrying it is in active, real-time communication with at least one other person at a different location. That assessment, made by a former FBI special agent with the professional vocabulary to say precisely what behavioral evidence means, shifted the public understanding of the surveillance footage from a single-person crime to a coordinated operation. It was a significant shift, because a coordinated operation is a different kind of crime from an individual act. It requires planning between multiple parties. It requires communication infrastructure, the walkie-talkie. It requires a shared understanding of the target, the timeline, the entry points, and the exit. It requires, in short, exactly the kind of preparation that the January 11th pre-visit and the insider knowledge in the ransom notes had already indicated was present. Jennifer Coffendafer connected those threats. The walkie-talkie was not an isolated anomaly in the surveillance footage. It was the communication infrastructure of an operation that included a pre-visit 3 weeks before the event, interior knowledge that required physical access to the home, a second actor whose DNA was found inside the residence, and a back door that no camera covered and that Nancy Guthrie had left unlocked. Everything she identified pointed in the same direction. And then, on March 10, 2026, she posted publicly that the search phase was over. The significance of that timing is not incidental. March 10 was 2 days before Sheriff Nanos sat down with NBC News and confirmed on the record that he had known the motive in this case since the very first day. Jennifer Coffendafer's public declaration that the search phase had ended came before that NBC interview, before the sheriff's confirmation that he knew the motive, before the public acknowledgement that the suspect might strike again. She was ahead of the official timeline. That is not surprising for someone whose career was built on reading exactly this kind of evidence. She was not waiting for Sheriff Nanos to confirm what the evidentiary record had already communicated to her professional judgment. Half glass full. In the context of everything Jennifer Coffendafer had analyzed about this case, the walkie-talkie, the coordinated operation, the 2 DNA profiles, the silent ransom deadlines, that phrase is not an expression of hope. It is an honest, restrained, professionally measured acknowledgement that the outcome of this case is no longer uncertain to the people who have been reading the evidence carefully. It is uncertain only to the public. And the distance between what the professional law enforcement community understands about this case and what has been confirmed publicly is, itself, one of the most significant details in the entire investigation. Jennifer Coffendafer knows the difference between a search and a recovery. She knows the difference between an investigation that is looking for a living person and an investigation that has moved past that phase into a different kind of work. She used the language of someone who has made that distinction professionally many times, and who applied it here with full awareness of what she was communicating. The search phase is over. Half glass full. 2 sentences from a former FBI special agent who spent her career weighing every word she used professionally. They are the most honest public communication about the likely outcome of this case that any credentialed voice has produced. Tracy Walder is a former officer of both the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency. Her career encompasses both domestic federal law enforcement and intelligence operations, a combination of institutional experience that gives her a specific analytical lens through which to examine cases that involve coordinated planning, targeted operations, and the deliberate use of misdirection. When Tracy Walder examined the Nancy Guthrie case, she offered a structural question that no other analyst covering this investigation had asked publicly, and that no official has confirmed or closed. The question was this: was Nancy Guthrie ever actually the target of this operation? Or was the intended target her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, the nationally recognized co-host of NBC's Today Show, and Nancy was simply the most accessible point of leverage? Read that question carefully because it does not simply reframe the motivation behind this case. It reframes the entire operational logic of everything that happened on the night of January 31, 2026 and in the weeks before it. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most recognizable faces in American media. She commands a public platform that reaches millions of people every morning. She has the financial profile, the public visibility, and the professional prominence that make her a realistic target for the kind of operation that the evidence in this case describes, one that required weeks of pre-operational surveillance, coordinated multi-person execution, interior knowledge of a private residence, and a $6 million Bitcoin demand. Nancy Guthrie, her 84-year-old mother, moved to Tucson to be close to her daughter. Her life in Tucson was structured around that proximity: the Friday evening dinners at Annie's house, the weekly routine that the people watching her had been observing long enough to know by heart. She was, in the specific operational language that Tracy Walder's combined FBI and CIA experience equips her to use, a soft target. Elderly, vulnerable, medically dependent, living alone, following a predictable routine that repeated itself on a schedule anyone willing to watch for 2 or 3 Fridays could map completely. If the operation was designed to leverage Savannah Guthrie, to reach the daughter through the mother, to create a crisis that would compel a prominent media figure to respond financially and quickly, then Nancy Guthrie was not the endpoint of the operation. She was the instrument. Tracy Walder's question has not been confirmed by any law enforcement authority. It has not been addressed in any press conference statement by Sheriff Nanos or any FBI official connected to the investigation. It has not been closed, officially ruled out as a line of inquiry by the people who have access to the full investigative record. But it has not been dismissed either. And the evidentiary record supports the question in specific ways that make it impossible to set aside entirely. The ransom demand was for $6 million. Nancy Guthrie was an 84-year-old retired woman living alone in Tucson, Arizona. $6 million in Bitcoin is not a demand calibrated to the financial profile of the target. It is a demand calibrated to the financial profile of her daughter, or to the institutional resources that might be mobilized on her behalf. The operation required weeks of pre-operational surveillance, coordinated multi-person execution, and insider knowledge of the target's home. The level of planning that this case documents is not consistent with a spontaneous or opportunistic crime. It is consistent with a targeted operation, one in which someone identified a specific outcome they wanted and worked backward from that outcome to design a method of achieving it. If the outcome was Savannah Guthrie's compliance, Nancy Guthrie's vulnerability was the path to it. Tracy Walder asked that question publicly because the evidence invited it. Because the documented record of this case, read through the analytical lens of someone with both FBI and CIA institutional experience, produces a profile of the operation that is more consistent with a targeted leverage play than with a conventional kidnapping. The question has not been answered. It has not been closed. And it sits at the center of the case alongside every other unanswered question. The motive the sheriff has known since day one, the 2 DNA profiles with no names, the walkie-talkie second party, the person who had been inside Nancy's home before January 31st, as part of the evidentiary architecture that the FBI is still building toward a name. On day 39 of the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the cadaver dogs were withdrawn. This fact has received less public attention than the surveillance footage, the DNA evidence, and the ransom notes. It should not have. Because the withdrawal of cadaver dogs from a missing persons investigation is not an administrative decision. It is an investigative judgment, a professional determination, made by the people directing the search resources of the investigation, about what the available evidence supports. Cadaver dogs are deployed in missing persons investigations when investigators need to search for human remains. They are trained specifically to detect the biological signatures of decomposition, signatures that are distinct from those of a living person and that require a specialized detection capability that standard search dogs do not possess. When you deploy cadaver dogs in a missing persons case, you are not abandoning hope. You are being thorough. You are covering every possibility the evidence requires you to consider. When you withdraw them on day 39, you are making a judgment. The judgment is not necessarily that the search is over. It may reflect a specific investigative assessment about where the evidence is pointing, a determination that the search area has been covered to the extent that the available resources and evidence support, and that the next phase of the investigation does not require the same search infrastructure. But placed alongside Jennifer Coffindaffer's March 10 declaration that the search phase was over, posted 2 days before the cadaver dogs were withdrawn, or in very close temporal proximity to that withdrawal depending on the precise dates in the timeline, the withdrawal carries a weight that the timeline alone communicates. Day 39. Cadaver dogs withdrawn. Day 40. Sheriff Nanos confirms on NBC News that he has known the motive since day 1. Day 40. Sheriff Nanos states the suspect may commit a similar crime again. 3 events. 3 consecutive days. Each one individually is a data point. Together, they form a sequence that every experienced investigator watching this case from the outside read immediately. The search phase of the Nancy Guthrie investigation ended on day 39. Jennifer Coffindaffer had said so publicly 2 days earlier. The sheriff confirmed 1 day later that he had known the motive since the beginning. And the public, watching the mainstream coverage of a case that was still being framed as an active kidnapping negotiation, had not yet been told what the professional law enforcement community already understood. The cadaver dogs were not coming back. And the half glass that Jennifer Coffindaffer described was not half full of a rescue operation. John Miller ran the FBI at the deputy director level. Paul Celino has built his career on knowing exactly what a crime scene is hiding. Jennifer Coffindaffer analyzed the walkie-talkie, tracked the investigation from inside the professional law enforcement community, and posted publicly that the search phase was over before the sheriff confirmed on NBC that he had known the motive since day 1. 3 people. 3 careers. 1 conclusion. This video will reach the person who has the missing piece of this case, but only if it keeps moving. Share it right now. Not after the next chapter. Right now. If you have watched every minute of this and you are still not subscribed to Cold Case Files USA, ask yourself honestly, why are you comfortable being the last to know when the arrest happens? When the sheriff finally says the motive. When the names behind those 2 DNA profiles become public. Subscribe now. Turn on every notification. Nancy Guthrie deserves to be found. And you deserve to be there when it happens. 3 credentialed voices. 3 independent assessments. 1 conclusion. John Miller, former deputy director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, said the crime went wrong almost immediately and that the ransom notes may have been written after the fact as a cover story. Paul Celino, veteran homicide detective, said directly and without qualification that he does not think Nancy Guthrie was kidnapped. Jennifer Coffindaffer, former FBI special agent who first identified the walkie-talkie as evidence of coordinated multi-person operation, declared the search phase of the investigation over on March 10 and described the situation as half glass full. None of these people are peripheral voices in the law enforcement community. None of them are offering commentary from outside the professional discipline that makes their assessments meaningful. They are the people whose careers were built on reading exactly this kind of evidence, and all 3 of them, independently, arrived at the same place. The ransom notes were not a genuine demand from people holding a living person. They were a cover story constructed after something had already happened inside Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home. The 2 silences after February 5 and February 9 were not a negotiating posture. They were the silence of people who had nothing left to negotiate with. Nancy Guthrie's medication is still on the counter in that house. Her Apple Watch is still where the person who wrote those notes knew it would be. Her pacemaker logged everything, every beat, every rhythm, every moment of what happened between 2:28 in the morning and the afternoon her family realized she was gone, and transmitted it to a manufacturer's server that the FBI has had access to since the earliest days of this investigation. And the man who has known the motive since day 1 is still not saying what it is. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed on March 12, 2026 that he has understood why this happened from the very beginning of the investigation. He said it on NBC News, with his name attached. And he followed it immediately with the statement that the person responsible may commit a similar crime again. He knows why it happened. He knows who the operation was designed around. He knows what the Pacemaker data shows. And he has not said any of it publicly. On March 12, 2026, 40 days after Nancy Guthrie walked from her son-in-law's car into the garage of her Tucson home and was never seen again, Pima County Sheriff Nanos sat down with NBC News. He confirmed two things in that interview. Both of them are on the record. Both of them have his name attached. The first, he has known the motive in this case since the very first day of the investigation. The second, the person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance may commit a similar crime again. He did not share the motive. Sit with those two statements for a moment, not separately but together in the sequence in which he delivered them. Because the combination of those two confirmations, offered in a single interview by the lead investigator of an active federal missing persons case, is the most chilling confirmed fact in the entire documented record of this investigation. He has known since day one why this happened. He understood the motive, the reason this specific person or these specific people targeted this specific 84-year-old woman in this specific house in northwest Tucson, from the moment investigators arrived at 12:15 p.m. on February 1st and found the blood at the front entrance and the medication on the counter and the Apple Watch in the room and the camera gone from the wall. And in 40 days of press conferences, public statements, media interviews and national coverage that reached millions of people, he did not say what it was. Then, in the same breath in which he confirmed he had known the motive since day one, he told NBC News that the person responsible might do this again. To someone else. To another family. To another elderly person in another house in another city whose routine had been watched long enough to know exactly when they would come home alone. Sheriff Nanos told the public there was no danger to the community on February 2nd. He told NBC News on March 12th that the suspect might strike again. And somewhere between those two statements, across 40 days of an investigation that routed DNA to a private Florida lab, released a crime scene in under 20 hours, and produced 4 different answers about who drove Nancy home, the motive that would explain all of it has remained inside the office of the Pima County Sheriff. Unspoken. Withheld. This is Chapter 5. This is the final chapter of the Nancy Guthrie series. And this is where every investigative thread, every confirmed forensic lead, every documented action the FBI is currently taking, and every question the evidence has not yet answered converges on the one thing that only one person has confirmed he knows. The motive. And why he still isn't saying it. The FBI does not request purchase records from a major national retailer on a specific product model unless they have a reasonable directional belief about where those records will lead. This is not a procedural observation. It is the operational reality of how federal investigations work. Retailer cooperation requests, formal requests to a corporation to produce transaction records tied to a specific product, are targeted actions. They require documentation, legal process, and a specific investigative logic that justifies the request. They are not fishing expeditions. They are the actions of investigators who believe they know approximately where to look and need the documentation to support what they already suspect. The FBI formally requested purchase records from Walmart tied to the Ozark Trail 25-liter backpack carried by the suspected individual in the surveillance footage from Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home. This was confirmed by Sheriff Nanos at a press conference. The backpack, black, 25 liters, confirmed in the footage and identified by law enforcement as sold exclusively through Walmart, is a specific enough product that its purchase history at regional Walmart locations produces a manageable, investigable dataset. Every person who purchased that specific backpack at a Walmart location in a relevant geographic radius in the period before January 31, 2026 is, in principle, identifiable through that request. Credit card records, loyalty program data, and in some cases surveillance footage from Walmart's own in-store camera systems can be cross-referenced against the purchase records to narrow the field further. The FBI also separately requested purchase records tied to the chest holster identified in the same footage. The holster, also a Walmart product confirmed by law enforcement, represents a second independent purchase thread, a second transaction record that, if it leads to the same name or the same geographic profile as the backpack purchase, significantly strengthens the evidentiary direction the investigation is moving. And in addition to the Walmart requests, law enforcement contacted gun stores across the Tucson region with inquiries specific to the holster model. According to reporting by Brian Enton, these contacts were targeted, not broad requests sent to every firearms retailer in Arizona, but specific outreach to specific stores based on a specific model identification. 3 parallel purchase record threads. The backpack. The holster from Walmart. The holster from regional gun stores. Each one pursued through a different institutional channel. each one targeted at a specific product identified from a single piece of surveillance footage. That is not the behavior of an investigation casting a wide net. That is the behavior of an investigation that has a reasonable directional belief and is building the documentary foundation to support it. Former forensic science professor April Stonehouse of Arizona State University, speaking to Brian Entin in a recorded interview, added a fourth physical evidence thread to this picture. One that has received less public attention than the backpack and holster purchases, but that carries its own significant evidentiary potential. The flashlight. The suspected individual held the flashlight in his mouth as he approached the front entrance of Nancy's Tucson home. His hands were occupied. The footage shows him managing the camera removal with the light source clamped between his teeth, directed forward. That contact, mouth to exterior surface of the flashlight, sustained long enough to manage the physical task of removing a wall-mounted camera, deposits biological material. Saliva. April Stonehouse confirmed in her recorded interview with Brian Entin that the exterior surface of a recovered flashlight, handled in the manner visible in the surveillance footage, is a viable source of DNA via saliva deposit. A biological profile recovered from the flashlight surface could either confirm or exclude a suspect, and could, if the profile is strong enough, produce an independent DNA identification entirely separate from the mixed profile already recovered from inside the home. According to Stonehouse's analysis, the FBI has been actively searching for that flashlight. As of the most recent confirmed public reporting, its recovery has not been confirmed. But the search for it continues. Because a flashlight held in a person's mouth for the duration of a physical task does not leave a trace of the person. It leaves the person themselves, in biological form on the surface of an object that, if recovered, becomes one of the most direct identification tools in the entire evidentiary record of this case. April Stonehouse is a forensic science professor at Arizona State University. Her expertise is not commentary. It is the specific, applied academic discipline of understanding what biological evidence can and cannot tell investigators, how it is collected, how it is preserved, how it is analyzed, and what conclusions it can support in a legal proceeding. When Brian Entin sat down with April Stonehouse for a recorded interview about the Nancy Guthrie case, the question he brought to her was precise. What does the image of a person holding a flashlight in their mouth, captured in surveillance footage, mean for the potential recovery of biological evidence from that flashlight? Her answer was equally precise. Saliva deposited on the exterior surface of an object through sustained oral contact is a viable source of DNA. The deposit does not need to be visible. It does not need to be substantial. Modern DNA analysis techniques, including low copy number DNA analysis, which can produce a genetic profile from extremely small biological samples, can work with the trace amounts of saliva that a person leaves on any surface their mouth contacts during a physical task. The flashlight visible in the surveillance footage from Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home was in the suspected individual's mouth for a sustained period. Not a brief moment of incidental contact. The footage shows him managing the removal of the Nest camera from the wall mount with the flashlight clamped between his teeth, a task that required physical effort, coordination, and time. The duration and nature of that contact, in April Stonehouse's professional assessment, is entirely consistent with the kind of sustained oral contact that deposits recoverable biological material on an exterior surface. Which means the flashlight is not just a piece of equipment visible in a surveillance image. It is, potentially, a direct biological identification tool. If the FBI recovers that flashlight, and if the DNA extracted from its surface produces a usable profile, investigators would have a biological sample that connects the suspected individual directly to the physical object he carried to Nancy Guthrie's front door on the night of January 31, 2026. That connection, physical object, biological sample, confirmed presence at the scene, is exactly the kind of evidentiary link that federal prosecutions are built on. According to April Stonehouse's analysis as reported by Brian Entin, the FBI has been actively searching for the flashlight since early in the investigation. That search has not been confirmed as successful in any public reporting as of the most recent available information. But the fact that it is ongoing, that investigators are actively looking for a specific piece of equipment that the biological evidence analysis indicates could carry the identity of the person who carried it, tells you something important about where the investigation is directionally. They are not searching for a name in the abstract. They are searching for an object that may carry that name in biological form. The Walmart purchase records for the backpack and the holster. The gun store inquiries about the holster model. The active search for the flashlight. 3 parallel threads, each one targeted, each one grounded in specific forensic logic, each one moving in the same direction. The direction of a name. And the name, when it comes, through a purchase record transaction, through a witness identification at a local business, through the DNA on the surface of a recovered flashlight, will answer not just who was at the front door of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home on the night of January 31st. It will answer who told him to be there. Who was on the other end of the walkie-talkie. Who had been inside that house before. Who knew about the Apple Watch and the broken floodlight. And who, in Sheriff Chris Nanos's professional judgment formed on day one of this investigation, had a motive specific enough and personal enough that he has chosen, for 40 days and counting, not to share it publicly. On day 45 of the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, FBI agents returned to her neighborhood in northwest Tucson. They did not come back to re-examine the surveillance footage from surrounding properties. They did not come back to ask neighbors about suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar faces. According to Brian Enton's reporting, confirmed by neighbors in the area who spoke to him directly, the agents who returned to the neighborhood on day 45 came back with a specific and targeted line of questioning. They asked about contractors. They asked about cleaning crews. They asked specifically about any service personnel, any person with a professional reason to be inside a private home, who had been given documented access to properties in the surrounding area in the weeks and months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Not strangers. Not people who had forced their way inside. People who had been invited. People who had been trusted. People who had been given a key or a door code or simply left alone in a room because their professional presence in the home was expected and unremarkable. The investigative logic embedded in that specific line of questioning is not subtle. It is direct. And it connects to the Ransom notes in a way that makes the targeted nature of the Day 45 canvas impossible to misread. The Ransom notes, confirmed by FBI Special Agent Heath Janicki and reported by KOL News 13 and TMZ, contain two interior details about Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home that had never been released publicly. The exact location of her Apple Watch inside the residence. The broken floodlight at the back of the property. Neither of those details is observable from outside the home. Neither can be confirmed through surveillance of the exterior. Neither is the kind of information that a person standing on the sidewalk, watching the house from a parked car, or viewing the property through binoculars from a neighboring yard could obtain. To know where Nancy Guthrie kept her Apple Watch, you had to be inside the room where she kept it and close enough and attentive enough to note its specific location. To know the floodlight at the back of the property was broken, you had to be at the back of the property at night, when the absence of light from a fixture that should have been functioning was observable. Both of those things require access, not surveillance. Access. The FBI's return to the neighborhood on day 45 with targeted questions about contractors and cleaning crews reflects a specific investigative hypothesis, that the person who provided the interior knowledge embedded in those ransom notes did not obtain that knowledge by breaking in or by forcing entry. They obtained it by being inside the home in a context that gave them time to observe, note, and retain the kind of small interior details. A personal device on a surface, a light fixture that no longer works, that only someone paying deliberate attention would register. A contractor. A cleaning crew member. Someone with a professional reason to be present, a routine that gave them time inside, and the specific attentiveness of a person who was not there simply to do a job. The FBI's Day 45 return to the neighborhood is not a broad investigative action. It is a targeted one. It reflects an investigative hypothesis specific enough to generate a specific line of questioning, not about vehicles, not about faces, about people given documented access to private homes. That hypothesis, in the professional judgment of the federal investigators pursuing it, is grounded in the most inexplicable detail of the entire ransom note record. The notes knew things that only someone inside the house could know. That means someone inside the house was paying attention for a reason other than the reason they said they were there. And the FBI, on day 45, went looking for the paper trail that documented when that person was inside and what their stated reason was. Contractor records. Cleaning crew schedules. Service appointments. The kind of documentation that every homeowner maintains in some form. An email confirmation, a payment record, a scheduled appointment in a calendar, that places a specific person inside a specific home on a specific date. The answer to how the insider got inside may be sitting in exactly that kind of record. Ordinary. Documented. Sitting in plain sight in the administrative history of a private home whose occupant had no reason to think the person she had let through her front door had any reason other than the one they gave her. Of all the evidentiary threads in the Nancy Guthrie case, the one that has received the least sustained public attention relative to its potential significance is the one that was there the entire time, transmitting continuously, independent of every other system in the house. The pacemaker. Nancy Guthrie had a pacemaker embedded in her chest. Sheriff Nanos confirmed this in his public statements about the case. The device was not simply a cardiac regulator. It was a data logger. It recorded continuous information about Nancy's cardiac activity, every beat, every rhythm, every variation, and transmitted that data to a manufacturer's server on its own independent connection. Not through her iPhone. Not through her home Wi-Fi network. Through its own transmission infrastructure, operating around the clock, whether Nancy was thinking about it or not. At 2:28 a.m. on February 1, 2026, Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing with her iPhone. Sheriff Nanos confirmed this detail publicly. The device pairs with a phone when the two are in proximity, within approximately 30 feet. When the sync dropped at 2:28 a.m., it confirmed that Nancy was no longer within 30 feet of her own phone. She was somewhere else in the house, or she was no longer in the house at all. But the pacemaker did not stop transmitting to the manufacturer's server. It kept logging. It kept recording. Every beat of Nancy Guthrie's heart from the moment the garage door closed at 9:50 p.m. on January 31st through the hours that followed, through 1:47 a.m. when the Nest camera was removed, through 2:12 a.m. when the motion event was registered, through 2:28 a.m. when the phone sync dropped, through 2:36 a.m. when the neighbor's Ring camera captured the unidentified vehicle, is recorded in the data that the pacemaker transmitted to the manufacturer's server. That data exists. It is stored. The FBI has had access to the fact of its existence since the earliest days of the investigation. Sheriff Nanos acknowledged the device and its data logging function in his public communications. What that data actually shows, what the cardiac record of Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker reveals about the hours between 2:28 a.m. and the afternoon of February 1st when her family called 911, has not been disclosed publicly. Not by the FBI. Not by Sheriff Nanos. Not by any law enforcement source cited in any public reporting on the case. That silence around the pacemaker data is, itself, a data point. In a case where investigators have been forthcoming about some forensic details, the blood at the entrance, the DNA profiles, the walkie-talkie, the January 11th pre-visit, the complete absence of any public disclosure about what the pacemaker's continuous cardiac record shows is notable. It suggests one of two things. Either the pacemaker data is being protected because it is so operationally significant to the active investigation that its disclosure would compromise a specific investigative action currently underway. Or the pacemaker data has told investigators something so definitive about what happened to Nancy Guthrie in those early morning hours that its public disclosure would answer the question that the investigation has not yet officially answered. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente, whose analysis of the physical evidence in this case was reported across multiple outlets, has noted the significance of the pacemaker as an independent biological record of the victim's condition during the period in question. A pacemaker does not lie. It does not malfunction in a way that produces false data. It records what the heart does, continuously, and transmits that record to a server that maintains it independently of any other system connected to the victim's daily life. Whatever Nancy Guthrie's heart was doing between 9:50 p.m. on January 31st and the afternoon of February 1st, the pacemaker recorded it. The FBI has that record. And they have not said what it shows. Annie Guthrie's Honda CR-V was held by investigators for more than 40 days. This detail, reported by Brian Enton citing independent sources, is not one that received sustained attention in the mainstream coverage of the Nancy Guthrie case. The vehicle was taken into investigative custody and retained for a period that extends well beyond what a routine examination of a family member's car in a missing persons case would typically require. According to Brian Enton's reporting, investigators downloaded data from the vehicle's electronic systems. Modern vehicles maintain extensive electronic records, GPS data, door open and close events, speed and acceleration records, Bluetooth connection logs, and in some cases audio system data that can confirm what devices were connected to the car and when. The data contained in a vehicle's electronic control systems can place the car at a specific location at a specific time with a precision that driver recollection alone cannot match. But what the downloaded data showed, what specific information investigators extracted from Annie Guthrie's Honda CR-V and what conclusions they drew from it, has not been publicly disclosed. What was disclosed, through Brian Enton's reporting, was this. After investigators downloaded the data from the vehicle's hardware, the car's electronic systems malfunctioned. The malfunction required dealer service before the vehicle could be returned to the family. The car has since been returned. The malfunction itself is not necessarily investigatively significant. Data extraction from a vehicle's electronic systems can, in some cases, produce operational disruptions in the vehicle's software that require professional service to resolve. It is a known technical consequence of certain data recovery methods applied to modern vehicle electronics. But the 40-plus days of retention, the sustained period during which Annie Guthrie's vehicle was held by investigators while the data was examined, reflects an investigative judgment that the electronic record of that car was worth the time and the process required to extract and analyze it fully. What that record showed, and whether it contributed to the directional hypothesis the investigation is currently pursuing, remains undisclosed. The car is back with the family. The data is with the FBI. The Ring camera belonging to the neighbor directly behind Nancy Guthrie's Tucson property went offline on the night of January 31, 2026. According to reporting by Brian Enton and accounts from the neighbor themselves, that device had never previously displayed a not available notification. Not once. In the entire period the neighbor had owned and operated the camera, a device designed for continuous outdoor monitoring, the kind of device that homeowners rely on precisely because of its consistent, uninterrupted operation. It had never gone offline before. Then, on the specific night that Nancy Guthrie disappeared, it did. A source within the investigation, speaking to Brian Enton, described the situation as odd. That word, odd, is not the language of someone dismissing a coincidence. It is the measured, non-committal language of someone inside an active federal investigation who cannot publicly characterize what they know about a piece of evidence but who is communicating, through careful word choice, that the coincidence has been noted and has not been explained away. No formal connection between the neighbor's Ring camera going offline and the events at Nancy Guthrie's home that night has been established in any public reporting. No official explanation for why the camera went offline on that specific night has been offered by law enforcement or by the camera's manufacturer. But place the neighbor's Ring camera alongside the other electronic anomalies from that night and the pattern becomes difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. The Nest camera at Nancy's front entrance was physically removed at 1:47 a.m., eliminated as a recording device by direct physical intervention. The second camera on Nancy's property registered only a motion timestamp at 2:12 a.m., capturing the event but not the footage. The Ring camera belonging to the neighbor directly behind the property, the camera that would have provided the closest exterior view of the back of Nancy's home, the back door, the backyard, the approach from the rear of the property, went offline. On that specific night. For the first time in its operational history. 3 cameras. 3 different failure modes. One night. The Nest camera eliminated by physical removal. The second camera triggered but not recording footage. The neighbor's Ring camera offline entirely. Former FBI and CIA officer Tracy Walder, who raised the structural question about whether Nancy was the intended target or Savannah was, has noted in her analysis of the case that coordinated interference with surveillance infrastructure is a documented feature of planned targeted operations, particularly those involving multiple actors operating across different points of access to a property simultaneously. The walkie-talkie confirms real-time coordination between at least 2 people during the operation. The mixed DNA confirms at least 2 people inside the house. The 3 camera failures, each different in mechanism, each affecting a different angle of the property, are consistent with a coordinated effort to eliminate recording coverage across multiple approaches simultaneously. Whether they reflect exactly that deliberate coordinated interference is a question the FBI has noted, through Brian Enton's sourced reporting, and has not officially closed. The neighbor's camera has never gone offline again. 46 days into the investigation, here is the complete confirmed record. Every item below is sourced to a named law enforcement official, a named journalist citing named sources, or a confirmed press conference statement. Nothing here is inference. Nothing here is speculation. This is what is established and not in dispute. The pre-visit, confirmed. The suspected individual visited the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home on January 11, 2026, 3 weeks before her disappearance, without equipment, without performing any action, and left. Recovered through chip-off forensics and 10 days of FBI collaboration with Google on the Nest camera's cloud backup data. Confirmed by 2 separate law enforcement sources cited by Fox News reporter Michael Ruiz. The equipment, confirmed. On the night of January 31st into February 1st, the suspected individual carried an Ozark Trail 25-liter backpack, a chest holster, a flashlight, and a walkie-talkie. The backpack and holster are Walmart products. Confirmed by Sheriff Nanos at press conference. The walkie-talkie identified as evidence of active coordination with at least one other person by former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Cadaver, reported by Newsweek. The camera removal, confirmed. The Nest camera at the front entrance of Nancy's home was physically removed from its wall mount by hand at 1:47 a.m. on February 1st. Not a power failure. Not remote interference. Confirmed by FBI Forensic Analysis and Sheriff Nanos. The blood, confirmed. Blood was found at the front entrance of Nancy's Tucson home. Vertical drop pattern consistent with a stationary source. Confirmed by DNA analysis as belonging to Nancy Guthrie. Confirmed by Sheriff Nanos, analyzed by Dr. Michael Bell and FBI profiler Jim Clemente. The DNA, confirmed. A mixed DNA profile from at least 2 individuals, neither Nancy Guthrie, neither matching any entry in the federal CODIS database, was recovered from the interior of Nancy's home. Confirmed by Sheriff Nanos in NBC News interview, March 12, 2026. The pacemaker sync drop, confirmed. Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing with her iPhone at 2:28 a.m. on February 1st, confirming she was more than 30 feet from her phone at that time. Her Apple Watch and daily medication were left inside the house. Confirmed by Sheriff Nanos. The ransom notes, confirmed. Notes demanding $6 million in Bitcoin arrived at KOL News 13 on February 1st and TMZ on February 2nd. The notes contained the location of Nancy's Apple Watch inside the house and the status of the broken floodlight at the back of the property, details never publicly released. Confirmed by FBI Special Agent Heath Janicki, reported by KOL News 13 and TMZ. The ransom deadlines confirmed. February 5th and February 9th deadlines passed with zero proof of life. No photograph, no phone call, no audio, no verifiable communication. Confirmed across all reporting on the case. The neighbor's Ring camera, confirmed. The Ring camera belonging to the neighbor directly behind Nancy's property went offline on the night of her disappearance, an event the neighbor confirmed had never previously occurred. Described as odd by an FBI source cited by Brian Enton. The motive, confirmed withheld. Sheriff Nanos confirmed on NBC News, March 12, 2026, that he has known the motive in this case since the very first day of the investigation. He did not disclose it. He stated the suspect may commit a similar crime again. Against the confirmed record, here is what the investigation has not yet publicly resolved. Who are the 2 individuals whose DNA was found inside Nancy Guthrie's home? 2 biological profiles. Neither in CODIS. Neither publicly identified. Neither connected to a name in any confirmed public reporting. Who provided the interior knowledge embedded in the ransom notes, and how did they access the home to obtain it? The Apple Watch location and the broken floodlight required physical access. The Day 45 Contractor canvas reflects a specific investigative hypothesis. The identity of the insider remains unconfirmed. Who was on the other end of the walkie-talkie? Real-time coordination between at least 2 people confirmed by Jennifer Cadaver's analysis. The identity of the second party, the person the suspected individual was communicating with during the operation, remains publicly unknown. Why did the neighbor's Ring camera go offline specifically that night? Never previously offline. No official explanation. Described as odd by an FBI source. No formal connection to the case established. No formal exclusion either. What does the pacemaker data show? Continuous cardiac record from 9:50 p.m. January 31st through the afternoon of February 1st. Transmitted to manufacturer's server independently. Held by the FBI. Not publicly disclosed. What did Annie Guthrie's Honda CR-V's electronic systems record? Retained for 40+ days. Data downloaded. Electronic malfunction after extraction required dealer service. Data with the FBI. Contents not publicly disclosed. Was Nancy the intended target, or was Savannah Guthrie the leverage point? Tracy Walder's structural question. Not confirmed. Not closed. Not officially addressed by any law enforcement authority. What is the motive Sheriff Nanos has known since day 1? Confirmed withheld. Confirmed known. Not shared publicly in 46 days of press conferences, media interviews and national coverage. Has the flashlight been recovered? Active FBI search confirmed by April Stonehouse's analysis reported by Brian Enton. Recovery not confirmed in any public reporting. What did the Walmart and gun store purchase record requests produce? Formally initiated. Directionally significant. Results not publicly disclosed. Every question above is grounded in the confirmed evidentiary record. None of them are speculative. All of them are the direct product of confirmed facts that produced confirmed gaps, places where the investigation has moved but the public record has not followed. Savannah Guthrie committed $1 million as a reward for information leading to a resolution in her mother's case. That commitment was not made quietly. It was made publicly, as a direct appeal to anyone with knowledge of what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night of January 31, 2026. $1 million. For information. For the one detail, the one name, the one connection that closes the gap between what the FBI has confirmed and what they have not yet been able to prove. Savannah Guthrie is on national television every morning. She has the platform, the visibility, and the public recognition that most families of missing persons do not have access to. She has used that platform consistently, not to insert herself into the investigative narrative, but to keep her mother's name in front of the people who might have the piece that matters. Her brother, Cameron Guthrie, who serves as a military pilot, has made public appeals alongside the reward announcement. The family is cooperating fully with federal investigators. They have not broken from the investigation publicly. They have not made statements that contradict or complicate the FBI's investigative direction. They are waiting. The way families wait when the investigation is still building and the answer is still one confirmed fact away from becoming a name. $1 million is a significant commitment. It reflects the family's understanding that the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie may be sitting with someone who has not yet decided to come forward. Someone who knows something, who has seen something, who heard something in January or February that did not make sense at the time and has been sitting with it since. If that person is watching this video, the reward is real. The FBI cooperation is real. And the one detail they are holding may be exactly the detail that closes this case. What follows is independent reporting by Cold Case Files USA. It is not confirmed by law enforcement. It has not been verified by the FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Dominic Evans has not been charged in connection with this investigation. His name is presented here under the standards of ongoing, unverified independent journalism, and should be understood as such. Cold Case Files USA has independently identified Dominic Evans as an individual whose alleged connection to this case warrants public attention. Evans is reportedly a 19-year acquaintance of Tommaso Caian, the last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. He has a documented prior criminal history that includes theft and robbery. According to independent reporting by this channel, his physical description is alleged to match the FBI's profile of the suspected individual captured in the surveillance footage from Nancy's Tucson home, including height and build, a tattoo on the right wrist, and a ring worn on the small finger of one hand. These are allegations. They are not confirmed facts. They are not law enforcement conclusions. They are the product of independent investigative journalism that this channel is presenting to the public because the public record is one of the mechanisms by which information in active investigation surfaces, and because the family of Nancy Guthrie has committed $1 million to the proposition that someone watching this video may have the piece that matters. If you have information about Dominic Evans or any other individual whose name, face, or described characteristics connect to the confirmed details of this case, the Ozark Trail backpack, the chest holster, the walkie-talkie, the Saturday pattern of activity, the insider knowledge of the interior of a home in northwest Tucson, the FBI tip line and the family's reward commitment are both accessible and both active. Dominic Evans has not been charged. His name has not been confirmed by law enforcement as connected to this investigation. Everything presented here is alleged and unverified by official sources. What is verified, what is confirmed and on the record and not in dispute, is that the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is ongoing, that the FBI is actively pursuing multiple forensic and documentary threats, and that the answer this case requires has not yet been publicly produced. Here is what we know about Nancy Guthrie that has nothing to do with evidence or investigation or the documented failures of the office that was supposed to find her. She was 84 years old. She moved to Tucson, Arizona to be close to her daughter. Not because she was told to. Not because circumstance required it. Because the proximity to Annie mattered to her in the way that proximity to the people you love matters when you are 84 and your body requires daily medication to keep functioning and you cannot walk 50 yards without someone to lean on. She played cards on Friday evenings. She sat at her daughter's table and had dinner and stayed late the way people do when the evening is good and the company is the reason you moved to the city in the first place. She did this every week. It was her routine. It was the shape of her life in Tucson. Ordinary, consistent, the kind of weekly rhythm that becomes invisible until someone starts watching it for a reason other than affection. She left her medication on the counter the night she disappeared. She left her Apple Watch on the counter too. She did not pack a bag. She did not prepare to go anywhere. She walked from the garage into her house the way she had walked from the garage into her house every Friday evening for as long as she had lived there, because she was home and home was supposed to be safe. Her pacemaker logged everything that happened to her heart that night. The data is on a server. The FBI has it. And 46 days later, the man who confirmed he has known the motive since day one has not yet told the world what it was. Nancy Guthrie is somebody's mother. She is somebody's grandmother. She is the woman who made the practical, loving decision to be near the people she loved even when her body made every day harder than the one before. She deserves to be found. She deserves the accounting that the evidence of this case, the 2 DNA profiles, the walkie-talkie, the insider knowledge, the silent ransom deadlines, the active FBI threads moving toward a name, is still building toward. The case is not closed. The FBI is in it. The purchase records are being examined. The flashlight is being searched for. The contractor canvas is still producing leads. The pacemaker data is in federal hands. And somewhere in the distance between the motive a sheriff confirmed he has known since day one and the moment he finally says it out loud, the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie after that garage door came down is waiting to be spoken. Share this video. Subscribe to Cold Case Files USA. Turn on every notification. Because when the answer comes, it will come fast. And you need to be here when it does.